Chapter 66. Just as Han Shuo rejoiced inwardly and was about to open his mouth to agree, another dwarf suddenly spoke up. "Bennett, the village chief, said we can't bring humans into the village. Have you forgotten?" "Benson, but he saved us from the hands of the forest troll villains." Bennett looked at the dwarf and said, "I know, but we have to listen to the village chief or we'll be punished." Benson said stubbornly, It's all right. I won't be going. It was nice meeting you guys. I'll be adventuring nearby, and maybe I'll run into you guys again. Goodbye." Han Shuo understood that he couldn't be too hasty when interacting with the dwarves. It wasn't something that could be done immediately if he wanted to gain their approval and friendship, so he immediately spoke up with a smile. "Dear friend, we're truly very sorry. This is a bag of wine that we brewed. Take it as our repayment. We hope you can forgive us." Bennett helplessly handed the bag of wine to Han Shuo and said apologetically. Han Shuo hoped that they could forge a suitable weapon in return, but he naturally wouldn't express it at this time. Receiving the bag of wine with a smile, Han Shuo humbly expressed his understanding and left with Little Skull. If he could train his magical yuan to the true demon stage, Han Shuo would naturally be able to forge his own magical weapons. But now, if Han Shuo wanted to obtain a suitable weapon, going through the dwarves was indeed a good method. There was a magical treasure called the Demon's Lair Edge. It was a bit longer than a dagger and a bit shorter than a longsword. The two edges were incredibly sharp, and the tip was as sharp as a triangular spike. After activating it using the method of magic control, it could take someone's head as it flew through the air. It was an extremely frightening weapon in the memories that Chu Kanglin had left behind. With Han Shuo's current level of demonic magic, he naturally couldn't refine iron weapons and directly forge the demonic treasure, the Demon's Lair Edge. However, Han Shuo wanted to forge a prototype through the dwarves and then use his demonic magic to slowly improve it for now. When he found suitable materials and mastered his demonic magic, he could reforge it a few times and display the perfect Demon's Lair Edge. As he thought about the forging of the Demon's Lair Edge, Han Shuo continuously thought about it. He had already decided to win the friendship of these dwarves and help him forge the Demon's Lair Edge. After returning to the Cemetery of Death, Han Shuo stopped at an empty space in front of the Black Ravine. The ground was littered with broken bones. Due to the existence of the boundary, the Cemetery of Death never saw the light of day all year round. The sky was shrouded in a thick layer of brown clouds. Han Shuo felt a sense of familiarity here. The densing energy here was very suitable for undead creatures. Fallen undead warrior, answer the call of the Dark Messenger and show your existence. As Han Shuo continuously chanted the necromancy summoning incantation of the skeletal warriors, one skeletal warrior after another slowly appeared in front of Han Shuo. Han Shuo waited until there were 5 skeletal warriors in the empty space before he felt that his mental strength was somewhat exhausted. He stopped summoning the skeletal warriors. Although Han Shuo's mental strength had greatly increased, he could only control the movements of 6 skeletal warriors, including Little Skull. After releasing his mental strength, Han Shuo issued an order. The 6 skeletal warriors, including Little Skull, began to move according to Han Shuo's command, gripping the bone daggers in their hands. With Han Shuo's mental manipulation, the skeletal warriors waved their bone daggers, and grotesquely shaped deep pits and ravines gradually formed on the ground. The ravine in the middle was like a long line that connected these deep pits. From a distance, these deep pits that were connected by the ravines looked like a sinister ghost face about 6 meters tall. The deep pits became the nostrils, eyes, and ears of the sinister ghost face, looking a bit sinister and evil. The original demon cave was left behind by Chu Kanglin. It was a kind of formation for cultivating the original demon. When Han Shuo had advanced from the solid realm to the pulse-opening realm, it had suddenly surged into Han Shuo's memories. The original demon cave had to use nether spirits as a foundation. 18 nether spirits were placed into the original demon cave, and through the operation of the formation, they would kill and devour each other. In the end, only the 3 strongest nether spirits would survive. Through the operation and condensation of the original demon cave, the 3 nether spirits could be refined into original demons. The original demon cave had to operate continuously for 36 days. During this time, the original demon cave would constantly absorb the yin qi of heaven and earth. Every day, the refiner would have to drip 6 drops of blood into it and inject demonic yuan into it. When the original demon was formed, it would directly communicate with the refiner's mind and silently invade the opponent's body during battle. Once the original demon entered the enemy's body, it would automatically devour the enemy's essence and blood. In Han Shua's memories, the original demon was known as the demon head of demonic practitioners. According to the different realms, demonic practitioners could refine 4 different levels of demon heads, namely, original demon, yin demon, mystical demon, and spirit demon. Among them, the original demon was the lowest level of demon head, and the refining method was the simplest. All it needed was the yin qi of heaven and earth and the blood of a demonic practitioner to refine it. Of course, it was precisely because of this that a small demon head like the original demon was also the weakest. Many things could harm it. Fire and ice could destroy both its body and soul. Even if it entered the enemy's body, as long as the enemy had a deep amount of true essence or demonic yuan, they could also refine it to death within the body. However, with Han Shua's current level of cultivation, he could only refine a small demon head like the original demon. Not only was Han Shua's realm insufficient, but he also didn't know the method for the time being. On one hand, Han Shua was refining this original demon as a tool for gathering information. On the other hand, if the enemy was invaded by the original demon during battle, it would still be of some help to Han Shua. At the very least, the enemy would have to divide their attention to deal with the original demon. This way, Han Shua would have the opportunity to take advantage of. If the enemy's strength was too low, just the invasion of the original demon would be enough to kill him. When the original demon cave was formed, Han Shua drove the skeletal warriors and cleaned up the original demon cave. Relying on the green ball and the same method as before, he cultivated his mental strength for an entire night. On the second day, Han Shua expended all of his mental strength to summon 18 wraiths and put them into the original demon cave. These wraiths came from a different dimension and belonged to the same type of existence as the dark spirits that Han Shua understood. After learning necromancy magic, Han Shua didn't need to go out and collect these wraiths at all. He only needed a summoning incantation to deal with them. It was truly very convenient. When the 18 wraiths entered the original demon cave, chilly winds suddenly blew in the surroundings. Waves of chilly air gathered from all directions of the cemetery of death into the original demon cave. The density of this kind of chilly air far exceeded Han Shua's expectations. It was only at this moment that Han Shua suddenly remembered that whether it was necromancy magic or the cultivation of demonic yuan, they both walked the path of evil. In 2 different worlds, these 2 methods were both evil cults, and indeed, they had many similarities. When the 2 methods were used in tandem, it really did yield twice the results with half the effort and saved Han Shua a lot of effort. When the original demon cave absorbed enough chilly air, the entire original demon cave that was manifested in the form of a sinister ghost face suddenly seemed to come alive. It seemed to be constantly twisting and changing, and clouds of black air seeped out of the 7 orifices of the ghost face. When he saw this scene appear, Han Shua immediately understood that it was just as he'd guessed. Wraiths could completely replace wraiths and become the foundational material for the original demon cave. When Han Shua bit his finger and dripped 6 drops of fresh blood into the original demon cave and infused them with magical yuan, the 18 wraiths abruptly sank into a berserk state. They let out shrill, ghostly cries and began to fight incessantly, falling into a battle for the 6 drops of fresh blood. It's done. We just need to wait for 36 days for the 3 original demons to take form. Han Shua looked at the original demon cave and said with a smile. He turned his head to look at the skeletal warriors beside him, and suddenly discovered that the little skull refined from demonic yuan seemed to be attracted by the original demon cave. Without Han Shua's orders, it stepped into the original demon cave and lay leisurely in a deep pit. It even raised its 2 calf bones, revealing a strange appearance. That strange appearance seemed to be enjoying. Han Shua was dumbstruck as he watched. He released his mental strength and was about to have the little skull rise from the original demon cave when he sensed the little skull's joy in his heart. This startled Han Shuo, and he couldn't help but look with a face of astonishment at the little skull lying comfortably in the original demon cave. After staring blankly for a while, Han Shuo couldn't understand what was going on. He observed the original demon cave and discovered that it was still operating as usual. Those wraiths were still killing each other inside and didn't seem to be affected at all. Han Shuo shook his head and murmured, "The little skull is getting weirder and weirder. Forget it. It doesn't look like it's affecting the operation of the Matrix anyways. I'll leave him be." Muttering to himself, Han Shuo walked towards the Cemetery of Death, planning to start studying the beginner magics of necromancy book. He wanted to advance in both fields and make breakthroughs in both at the same time. Chapter 67. For the next few days, Han Shuo stayed in the Cemetery of Death, studying the book Beginner Magics of Necromancy, while taking care of the original demon cave. Making use of the round green ball that most likely belonged to the Cemetery of Death, Han Shuo would receive a large increase in mental strength every time his head was in severe pain. Except, as the number of times he used the round green ball increased, Han Shuo could clearly feel that the rate at which his mental strength increased became slower and slower. It looked like this strange round green ball wouldn't be able to help him continue increasing his mental strength. As the number of times increased, the benefits that Han Shuo received became smaller and smaller. On this day, Han Shuo meditated for a while and left the Cemetery of Death after injecting fresh blood and magical yuan into the original demon cave. After patrolling the vicinity where he'd met the dwarves last time, Han Shuo discovered traces of a dwarf and followed this dwarf without batting an eyelid. Han Shuo finally discovered this dwarf after walking for a while and stopped in front of a hidden cave entrance. There were lush shrubbery near the cave entrance, and it was obvious that the surroundings had been purposefully arranged. If it wasn't for the dwarf moving some large leaves away after arriving here, Han Shuo wouldn't have discovered that there was a cave here. After observing the vicinity of the cave entrance, Han Shuo discovered that a few dwarves had appeared nearby. They held iron shovels and hammers as they walked into the cave one by one. After a while, Bennett, who'd given Han Shuo a bag of fine wine, was supported out of the cave by two dwarves. He looked like he'd suffered a bit of injury. A faint sound traveled from afar, and Han Shuo's ears were sharp. He could immediately tell that it was the sound of magical creatures approaching. He crouched on the branch of a large tree and waited for a while. Han Shuo saw two windblade wolves slowly appear in the distance. His thoughts raced. Han Shuo broke off a branch from the large tree and threw it towards the shrubs next to the cave entrance. The sound of the branches falling to the ground clearly attracted the windblade wolves. Two of them moved upon hearing the sound and suddenly changed direction with brisk footsteps, heading towards the entrance of the cave where the dwarves were waiting. By the time Bennett and the other two dwarves had heard the commotion and looked around, the two windblade wolves had already appeared in their sights. "Oh, damn it. It's a windblade demonic wolf. Let's hurry back to the cave." The injured Bennett couldn't help but grumble when he saw the two windblade wolves appear and planned to return to the cave. "Bennett, it's too crowded in the cave. If these two windblade wolves follow us into the cave, then they'll be in danger." One of the dwarves waved the hammer in his hand when he heard Bennett's words. Hearing his words, Bennett thought for a moment and said, Then let's kill these two damned windblade wolves at the door." "No, the three of us won't be able to do it. I think we should have the tribesmen in the cave stop mining and join forces to kill these two windblade wolves first," the dwarf said. At this moment, Han Shuo suddenly jumped down from the large tree and arched his body from the ground. He dashed out like lightning and nimbly dashed towards the two windblade wolves after revealing himself from the distant shrubbery. The dagger in his hand turned into a bolt of cold lightning as it shot towards one of the windblade wolves. Han Shuo followed up quickly like a cheetah and faced the other windblade wolf with his bare fists. The two windblade wolves had been eyeing the three dwarves covetously with their backs to Han Shuo. One of the windblade wolves had already been stabbed in the back by Han Shuo's dagger. The other windblade wolf turned around, and a windblade whistled towards Han Shuo. Han Shuo suddenly changed directions in his rapid flight and miraculously dodged the wind blade attack. His body had already rushed in front of the windblade wolf. The windblade wolf that had released a wind blade raised its sharp claws and pounced towards Han Shuo when it saw the enemy in front of it. The crossbow bolt in his left sleeve first landed on the two claws of the windblade wolf that was pouncing towards him. Han Shuo's fist, imbued with the frigid air of the mystical glacial spellfire, had already landed on the windblade wolf's head amidst the wolf's screech. Ayo! The windblade demonic wolf let out a shrill cry. Cold air emanated from its body, and it fell to the ground like a piece of frozen meat. On the other side, the two dwarves suddenly threw out the axes in their hands and smashed them towards the other windblade wolf. However, the two dwarves' strength was obviously inferior to Han Shuo's, and the speed at which they threw their axes wasn't too fast. The already injured windblade wolf was actually able to dodge them. However, while it could dodge the two dwarves' axes, it couldn't dodge the crossbow bolt that Han Shuo had shot at close range. In the end, the windblade wolf was unable to escape and fell down powerlessly. "Oh, heroic friend, you've saved Bennett again. How can I thank you?" The injured Bennett couldn't help but cry out in surprise when he saw Han Shuo finish off the two windblade wolves. Han Shuo only stopped after he'd expertly taken away the two windblade wolves' cores and furs. He smiled faintly. "You shouldn't thank me. These two windblade wolves were my prey to begin with. I didn't help you, but it was your two friends who helped me with their axes. You're too polite. Don't you want the bodies of the wolves?" One of the dwarves looked at Han Shuo with surprise when he saw that Han Shuo had taken away the cores and furs of the windblade wolves, but hadn't cared about the bodies at all. "Yes, I only need the cores and furs of the windblade wolves. That's the only way I can sell them for a good price." "Then, dear friend, can you give us the bodies of the windblade wolves?" "Of course I can, but what do you want the bodies of the windblade wolves for? They don't have much value." "The bodies of the windblade wolves can be cooked into food." Bennett looked oddly at Han Shuo and explained, "To us, the meat of the windblade wolves is an extremely delicious type of meat." Han Shuo had eaten the meat of the windblade wolves before and felt that it was a bit dry and hard to chew. It didn't seem to be a delicious type of meat. He hadn't thought that these dwarves would be interested in it. Han Shuo felt that it was a bit odd when he heard Bennett say this. However, dwarves weren't humans, and perhaps their habits were different. Han Shuo thought to himself. "Right, what are you doing here?" Han Shuo asked. "This is a mine that we discovered. There are some copper and iron ores inside, but the inside often collapses. The large rocks inside the mine will fall down, and it's very difficult and dangerous to mine. Quite a few of our tribesmen have been injured, and another tribesman was crushed to death a few days ago. I was accidentally hit by a rock just now and had no choice but to retreat." Bennett seemed to be quite fond of Han Shuo and didn't even hesitate before revealing the secret that the dwarves were keeping. The other two dwarves had wanted to stop Bennett, but didn't even have the time to speak when they discovered that Bennett had already finished speaking. They couldn't help but blow at their beards and glare at Bennett, as if reprimanding him for speaking without thought. "So that's how it is. If you don't mind, I can help you mine the mine. I think that with my help, you'll be in much less danger." A thought struck Han Shuo, and he suggested with a smile, "No, it's too dangerous inside. You'll be crushed by rocks if you go in. If you encounter a large area of collapse, there'll be no way to walk out and you'll be trapped until you die." Bennett reminded kindly, "Don't worry, I won't do it myself. I'm a necromancer and can summon necromancers to help you mine the mine. There won't be any problems." Han Shuo said with a smile, "If that's the case, then I'll go in and discuss it with them and see if they agree." Bennett thought for a moment and said this, allowing the two dwarves to support him as they re-entered the mine. After a while, one of the dwarves walked out and said politely to Han Shuo, "Honored friend, we're willing to share the secrets of this mine with you. Please come in and mine this mine with us." "Delighted," Han Shuo said humbly. "Thank you for your trust. I'm very happy to work with you." After saying this, the dwarf first dragged the bodies of the two windblade wolves into the mine and then covered the entrance with leaves with Han Shuo. Finally, he led Han Shuo into the mine. Chapter 68. The inside of the mine was even narrower than Han Shuo had imagined. The dwarves were on the shorter side and could walk freely within, but it was a bit inconvenient for Han Shuo. Even with the illumination of oil lamps along the way, the inside of the mine still appeared quite dim. After walking for a few minutes, Han Shuo had no choice but to bend his body. The deeper he walked, the darker and more damp it became. Broken rocks could be seen everywhere on the ground, and the three dwarves finally stopped when Han Shuo discovered that it was difficult to walk with his body bent. The dwarves in front of him were mining with iron shovels and hammers in their hands, and the sounds of hammering rang out incessantly. When they discovered that Han Shuo had walked in, they involuntarily stopped what they were doing and looked at Han Shuo with suspicious gazes. After passing through these narrow passes, the tunnel will become more and more spacious as we go forward. Although there are more iron and copper ores inside, rocks will fall from the top when we move them. There was even a collapse a few days ago. We spent a lot of effort to reconnect the tunnel. Bennett leaned against the hard rock wall tiredly and looked at Han Shuo as he explained. Nodding, Han Shuo said, "All right, make some space for me. I'm going to summon the skeletal warriors and have them mine the ore inside." Following Han Shuo's instructions, the dwarves in the innermost part of the tunnel all retreated out of there. When there weren't any dwarves left inside, Han Shuo chanted a necromancy incantation and 7 skeletal warriors appeared one after another in the tunnel, directly blocking the entrance. Han Shuo had originally only been able to control 6 skeletal warriors, but after meditating with the green ball these past few days, his mental strength had clearly improved once again. He could now control 7 skeletal warriors. Put your iron shovels and hammers on the ground. I'll have the skeletal warriors use your tools and mine the ore in the innermost part. Han Shuo looked at the dwarves retreating after the 7 skeletal warriors had appeared. When the dwarves heard Han Shuo's words, they hesitated for a moment and threw out the mining tools in their hands, one by one under Bennett's persuasion. Han Shuo manipulated the skeletal warriors to abandon the bone daggers in their hands and pick up the mining tools on the ground. Each of them bent their bodies and slowly walked deeper into the mine. A wraith was released and floated into the depths of the mine along with the skeletal warriors on Han Shuo's orders. Han Shuo could observe the surroundings with the help of this wraith. With the wraith leading the way at the front, Han Shuo could personally observe the scene in the depths of the mine. Indeed, it was as the dwarves had said. The skeletal warriors crouched down and slowly made their way through an extremely narrow hole. The further they went, the larger the space became. However, there were no lighting devices inside, and Han Shuo was unable to see his surroundings clearly. When the wraith and the skeletal warriors had walked a great distance and Han Shuo felt that he couldn't control these dark creatures any further, he couldn't help but assign the task of mining ore. Using the wraith as a visual medium, Han Shuo focused his mental strength and manipulated the 7 skeletal warriors to start hammering away at some of the ore in the surroundings. Following the movements of the skeletal warriors, loud clinking sounds came from within. After a while, Han Shuo could clearly feel with the help of the wraith that the rocks at the top of the mine had loosened due to the skeletal warriors digging. After a while, a few large rocks actually fell down and smashed a skeletal warrior into a pile of broken bones. Focusing his mental strength, Han Shuo closed his eyes and stood in front of the dwarves. He carefully manipulated the skeletal warriors and had the wraith float above the top of the cave. He carefully observed the large rocks that had loosened and hurriedly ordered the skeletal warriors below to take cover as soon as the rocks fell. After a long while, another skeletal warrior was smashed to pieces by a large rock. Han Shuo's mental strength was severely depleted, and he felt a bit dizzy. He immediately understood that he'd expended too much mental strength and hurriedly ordered the remaining 5 skeletal warriors to stop mining. They picked up some of the crushed ore on the ground and started moving it to the back. When the 5 skeletal warriors moved the mined ore to the narrow pass one by one, the dwarves on Bennett's side called out and didn't wait for Han Shuo's orders. They walked to the pass one by one and picked up the ore there, moving it to the safety of Han Shuo's side. After a few more minutes, Han Shuo felt that his mental strength could no longer support the skeletal warriors' continued work. He immediately made the decision to cast an incantation and send the remaining skeletal warriors, as well as the wraith, back to the other dimension. By this time, the cave entrance in front of Han Shuo was already filled with dozens of large and small pieces of ore. The dwarves cheered as they fought to crush the ore and put it into the large pockets on their backs. "Oh, my dear friend, because of your help, we've harvested more ore today than we've harvested in a week. These cute iron and steel ores can be refined into beautiful weapons. This is truly a happy thing." Although Bennett was injured and very tired, he was in exceptionally good spirits. He looked at his companions as they smashed and picked up the ores in high spirits, excitedly expressing their gratitude to Han Shuo. The other dwarves laughed heartily as they picked up the ore excitedly and took out the wine they'd brought with them. They gulped it down happily and made hearty noises. "Oh my gosh, what's this? What's this?" Suddenly, one of the dwarves screeched loudly. This scream attracted the attention of all the other dwarves, and they all surged towards this dwarf. Han Shuo was also startled and couldn't help but look at this dwarf. However, he'd already been surrounded by the other dwarves, and Han Shuo couldn't see anything. He secretly wondered if something had happened. Just as Han Shuo was guessing suspiciously, Bennett suddenly lost his composure and laughed wildly. He even threw the wineskin in his hands into the air, waving his arms and legs as he cheered excitedly. "Black iron, damned black iron. I'm sure this really is black iron. My gosh, there's black iron in there. The village chief will go crazy if he finds out." When the other dwarves heard Bennett's words, their faces all flushed red and they couldn't help but dance with joy. They raised their hammers and furiously pounded the surrounding stone walls, making loud booms and giving Han Shuo quite a fright. Han Shuo breathed a sigh of relief in his heart when he heard Bennett's words. He understood that these dwarves must have obtained some wondrous metal, which was why they were so excited. He was also secretly happy. The dwarves finally calmed down after a while. Han Shuo finally asked, "Bennett, what kind of ore is this black iron? Is it very precious?" Bennett nodded like a chick pecking at rice and said excitedly, "Of course, it's very precious, precious to the extreme. Black iron is the densest and hardest of all ores, but its mass is the smallest of all metals. In addition, it never rusts and can be changed by adding other materials. It's the best material for making weapons. This is a gift from the gods." Han Shuo was about to say some words of congratulations when a flash of inspiration suddenly flashed through his mind. A piece of memory surged into his mind, and he abruptly understood from the attributes of this black iron that this black iron was actually a precious material for forging demonic treasures in Chu Kanglin's memories, dark steel. Although black iron and dark steel had different names, according to Bennett's description and Chu Kanglin's memories, Han Shuo immediately understood that these two ores with different names should refer to the same thing. The black iron that Bennett spoke of was also the dark steel that Chu Kanglin had spoken of in his memories. It's a pity that there's only a very small piece. It looks like it's only enough to forge a small dagger. After his excitement, Bennett looked at the black iron in the dwarf's hands and said with some regret, "Bennett, don't be too discouraged. There's definitely more black iron in there. Maybe we'll be able to get a bigger piece next time. That way, we can forge the sharpest weapons." The dwarf Benson said, "Dear friend, thank you very much for your help. We're willing to share our mine with you. Can you continue to help us?" "We're willing to share the ores we mine with you." Bennett looked at Han Shuo with a face full of longing when he heard Benson's words and said pleadingly, "I'm very happy that you trust me so much. I'm happy to help you, but I'm too tired today and want to rest for the night. I'll come back tomorrow to continue mining with you, all right?" Han Shuo was secretly delighted as he spoke humbly to Bennett. Of course. We'll come over with the village chief first thing tomorrow morning. I hope you can come again," Bennett said hastily. Nodding, Han Shuo smiled faintly. Then, "See you tomorrow." Han Shuo didn't take a single piece of or with him after he'd spoken and walked confidently towards the entrance of the mine, leaving behind a few wildly excited dwarves gulping down wine. Chapter 69. When he'd exhausted his mental strength, the progress he made when he meditated again was noticeably faster than under normal circumstances. When Han Shuo returned to the cemetery of death and his mental strength was once again full after a night of meditation, Han Shuo came to this conclusion. However, to a necromancer, without mental strength, they wouldn't be able to release any magic. This would undoubtedly put them in a very disadvantageous situation. Therefore, under normal circumstances, no necromancer would use up all of their mental strength in one go. Since the dwarves were willing to share the mine, Han Shua couldn't help but have other thoughts. The iron and copper ores in the mine seemed to be extremely large. With the dwarves' working speed, it would take a very long time to excavate all of them. For Han Shua, he could absolutely use his summon creatures to speed up the mining process. If these copper and iron ores were transported to the Empire, Han Shua would be able to earn handsomely for himself. According to Han Shua's understanding and the dwarves' behavior, Han Shua understood that these black iron ores would be very valuable resources. They might be able to sell for an astronomical price. There should be many dwarf villages within the dark forest. This batch of dwarves didn't look like there were too many of them. They probably wouldn't need that much iron and copper ores even if they all added up. Since this was the case, Han Shua had other plans in his heart. After infusing the original demon cave with fresh blood and magical yuan, Han Shua left the cemetery of death early in the morning and hurried in the direction of the mine. Han Shua had thought that he was early enough, but when Han Shua arrived at the entrance to the mine, he discovered that the dwarves had already arrived. The dwarves were twice as many as usual today. They seemed to have been excited the entire night, and all of their eyes were red, but their expressions were quite excited. One of the dwarves, with a grizzled beard and a bent body and a walking stick, was giving instructions to the other dwarves with a solemn expression. The group of dwarves, including Bennett, all listened respectfully to his instructions. Purposefully making footsteps to attract the dwarves' attention, Bennett immediately raised the iron hammer in his hand and yelled when he saw Han Shua appear, "Hey, dear friend, we've been waiting for you for a long time." When Han Shua arrived, the old dwarf with a grizzled beard bowed in human etiquette to greet Han Shua, saying amiably, "Brave and powerful friend, many thanks for your help. I am Calvin, chief of this dwarf village, pleased to meet you. My name is Han Shua. I'm honored to have your trust." This place was far from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, and no one knew his identity. Therefore, Han Shua used his real name to negotiate with these dwarves. "Brave Han, your name is amazing. I've never heard of anyone using such a name. Hehe, the children all say that you're a trustworthy person. Our village is willing to share the secrets of the mine with you. I hope we can live in harmony in the future." Calvin first looked a bit oddly at Han Shua, seeming to be a bit puzzled by Han Shua's name. However, a smile soon spread across his face, and he spoke with a smile. "Then, I think we can begin our work." Although Calvin was neither in a hurry nor too slow, the other dwarves all looked at the mine behind them, obviously revealing their impatient thoughts. Han Shua didn't say much and directly stated his request for work. "No rush." Calvin thought for a moment and stared at Han Shua. "Han, why are you helping us so much? We're willing to share this mine with you. Why didn't you take half of the iron and copper ores with you yesterday?" Older people thought more than others, all right, and the dwarves were no exception. Han Shua looked at Calvin and mused for a moment, explaining, "First of all, I have a grudge against the forest troll. Add to that the fact that I was won over by Bennett and the others' fearless fighting spirit. That's why I helped them. Later on, they were the ones who helped me with the Windblade Wolves. Those two Windblade Wolves were originally my prey, and it was very easy for me to help you mine the ores. I don't know how to forge weapons, so these iron and copper ores are useless to me. That's why I didn't take them with me when I left. Elder Calvin, I hope you can believe me." Nodding, Calvin bowed to Han Shua and said humbly, "Apologies, Han. I'm older and have seen too many cunning humans. That's why I didn't take it to heart." Nodding, Calvin bowed to Han Shua and said modestly, "My apologies, Han. I'm older and have seen too many cunning humans. That's why I asked out of turn. I hope you don't mind." "You're doing the right thing. I completely understand your concerns. It'll be difficult for us to mine the deeper parts of these mines with just us. Since we're willing to share the secret with you, we're willing to share everything in there with you, including the black iron ore bestowed by the gods. We're willing to share everything equally with you. I hope you won't refuse, otherwise we'll truly be embarrassed. Calvin thought for a moment and solemnly made his promise. When Han Shuo heard these words, he sighed inwardly. Although the dwarves were stubborn and hot-tempered, they were a race worth befriending. Han Shuo was a bit ashamed of his own ulterior motives after Calvin's promise. He mused for a moment. Don't worry, Elder. I completely agree to your suggestion. In addition, if I have enough black iron ore, I beg you to forge a weapon for me. Is that possible? No problem, Han. Don't worry. If we have enough black iron ore, I'll personally supervise them and forge a suitable weapon for you. Calvin promised with a smile. All right, I think we can start working. Han Shuo finally set his mind at ease at this moment and sighed inwardly that the demon's lair edge had finally been secured. He smiled faintly and walked into the mine with the dwarves. After half a day of digging, Han Shuo's mental strength was once again exhausted and he retreated, weary and exhausted. His gains this time were even more abundant than yesterday's. Apart from large amounts of iron and copper ore, he'd obtained another 2 pieces of black iron ore, one large and one small. Han Shuo generously gave the large piece to the dwarf village chief and only threw the small piece into his space ring. At the entrance of the mine, the dwarves were all smiles as they carried the copper and iron ores on their backs, planning on carrying today's gains back to the village. Dear Han, what kind of weapon do you need forged? Calvin asked Han Shuo before he left. After thinking for a moment, Han Shuo took out his dagger and drew a blueprint of the demon's lair edge on the ground. He pointed at the weapon on the ground and explained to Calvin, "This is the weapon. I want the best and sharpest one. Do you think it'll be possible?" Calvin squinted his eyes and bent down, staring at the blueprint of the demon's lair edge and observing it for a while. He said thoughtfully, "I've never seen the shape of this weapon before. It looks quite interesting and I think forging it shouldn't be a problem. However, if you want the best and sharpest one, you'll need some rare materials. Our village doesn't have enough of them." A thought struck Han Shuo as he thought of the buzzed merchant guild. It looked like he'd have to throw caution to the wind for the sake of this demon's lair edge. He couldn't help but say, "What other materials do you need? Elder can tell me, and I'll think of a way to gather the rare materials. I need an extremely good weapon. Do you have pen and paper?" Of course. Han Shuo took out the pen and paper he'd prepared before coming to the cemetery of death from his space ring and handed them to Calvin, saying, "Elder, don't worry about the lack of materials. I'll think of a way to gather the materials as soon as possible." All right then. Calvin nodded and began to jot down a row of rare materials on the paper. He finally handed it to Han Shuo, saying, "Han, as long as these materials can be gathered, I promise to forge an incomparably sharp weapon for you. When I have enough black iron or to forge this weapon, I'll think of a way to gather these materials. I'll come back earlier tomorrow to mine the ore." Han Shuo left the mine after saying this. Han Shuo continued to mine the mine with the dwarves for the next 10 days. When Han Shuo had gathered enough black iron ore and the dwarves had all reaped a bountiful harvest, Calvin suggested that they temporarily stop mining the ore and start refining the ore into weapons. They'd come back to mine the ore when they didn't have enough weapons in the future. During this time, Han Shuo had already gained the dwarves' trust and accepted Calvin's invitation to go to their village to drink and celebrate. He also knew the correct way to their residences. Early this morning, after Han Shuo infused fresh blood and magical yuan into the original demon cave in the Cemetery of Death, he directly used the transportation matrix to leave the Cemetery of Death. Chapter 70. Through the transportation matrix, Han Shuo appeared directly at the hidden tomb in the mountain behind the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, in the blind corner that Han Shuo had dug up. Putting away the 6 magical sticks, Han Shuo removed the stone slab placed at the entrance of the tomb and walked out. The sky was only just beginning to brighten. Han Shuo didn't walk from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, but instead took a detour and headed directly for the northern street according to the location on Fabian's card. There were many luxurious and tall buildings in the northern district of Asen City. Many of the empire's nobles and celebrities resided within. The number of city guards here was also the highest. There were already many armored and armed city guards patrolling the area early in the morning. Han Shuo straightened his clothes and wiped off the dust that had just landed on him. Only then did he head for the northern street, according to the records on Fabian's card. After a while, Han Shuo stopped in front of a building. There were no guards in front of the door, and it didn't look as eye-catching as the surrounding buildings. Han Shuo arrived in front of the door and focused his attention to observe his surroundings. He only began to knock when he discovered that no one seemed to be paying attention to him. Last time at the Buzzed Merchant Guild, Phoebe had forcefully pushed the death of the Shadow Ghost assassin onto him. The expression on Grover's face before he left already indicated that this person harbored a grudge. According to Phoebe, whether it was Shadow Ghost or Grover, they both had experts in their hands that could kill him. Therefore, Han Shuo had no choice but to be careful on his return to the Empire this time, afraid of attracting the attention of either Shadow Ghost or Grover. After a while, a gentle-looking butler opened the door and looked at Han Shuo. He bowed with a smile and asked, "Good morning, sir. May I ask who you are looking for?" "I'm Brian. I've come to discuss a business deal with Fabian." Han Shuo responded just as politely, "So it's Mr. Brian. I've heard Fabian mention you before. Please come with me." The butler immediately moved aside when he heard Han Shuo's name, indicating for Han Shuo to enter. When Han Shuo walked in, the butler stuck his head out and carefully observed the entrance before hurriedly closing the door and leading Han Shuo inside, appearing to be very cautious. The buildings inside were still very ordinary. Compared to the Buzzed Merchant Guild's extravagance, this place didn't seem very eye-catching, and the size of the buildings was far less vast. After walking for only a minute, the butler brought Han Shuo into a large hall and called over an ordinary-looking maid. After serving tea and snacks, she said, "Mr. Brian, please wait a moment. I'll go call Fabian for you right away." After the butler left, the maid filled Han Shuo's cup with tea and also left the hall. After a while, the fat Fabian walked in from outside the hall, laughing heartily. Bright and hearty laughter sounded from Fabian's mouth, but his face was a bit haggard and his spirits weren't too good. It seemed that he hadn't been very comfortable recently. "Oh, it's Brian. It's great to see that you're safe and sound." Fabian pulled out a chair and sat down after entering, laughing heartily. "I'm also very happy to see that you're fine. I went into hiding after leaving the Buzzed Merchant Guild last time. Neither Shadow Ghost nor Grover's men will be able to find me, so you don't need to worry about me at all. It's you, on the other hand, that doesn't seem to be doing too well." Han Shuo sized up Fabian and said slowly, "Don't mention it. Grover is becoming more and more domineering now, and our days have indeed been a bit rough lately. All right, what business do you have to discuss with me this time?" Fabian sighed and said a bit helplessly. Han Shuo didn't want to pay attention to the grudge between them and Grover. Fabian wasn't willing to go into detail with Han Shuo's intentions. He thought for a moment and said, "I've come to find you this time not to sell any goods, but to purchase some rare materials from you." "Oh, what rare materials? Take a look at this list. I need all of the materials in here. How much do you think it will cost?" Han Shuo handed over the list of materials that the dwarf village chief, Calvin, had listed to Fabian and said. Fabian took the list from Han Shuo and looked over it carefully. He thought for a moment and said to Han Shuo, "Brian, even I'm not too sure about some of the materials in here. I'm afraid I can't make the decision. If you don't mind, I'd like to have our Miss Phoebe speak with you." Han Shuo stared blankly. Could it be that Calvin's list of materials required items that were extremely valuable? Musing for a moment, Han Shuo nodded and said, "All right, the same goes for Miss Phoebe. I have an urgent need for these items. When can I see her?" "Our miss is here right now. I'll go ask for her instructions right now. Wait a moment." Fabian rose and said to Han Shuo before leaving the hall. After a while, Phoebe walked into the hall with Fabian with a cold expression on her face. She was dressed simply, but it was hard to conceal her stunning features. Phoebe swept her eyes over Han Shuo as if nothing had happened when she walked in, making Han Shuo feel a bit baffled. Finding a chair to sit on, Phoebe took a long look at the list that Han Shuo had listed. Her brow furrowed slightly as she lifted her head to look at Han Shuo, saying, "These materials should be used to forge weapons. Some of the items in here are indeed quite rare. You found the right person to purchase them from us." Joy welled up in his heart, but there wasn't any expression of happiness on his face. Han Shua's right index finger drummed on the table every now and then as he said faintly, "Name your price." Nodding, Phoebe's wise and far-sighted eyes flashed craftily for a moment as a beautiful curve appeared at the corners of her lips. She said, "Apart from the black gold ore, we can sell the rest to you. Especially since you helped us last time. I can even give you a discount. We'll only charge you a total of 3,500 gold coins. The price is absolutely fair." 3,500 gold coins. Han Shua's heart jumped. He hadn't thought that the 10 or so rare materials that Calvin had listed would be worth so much, and judging from Phoebe's words, this price was already quite low. The black gold, or seemed to be a bit troublesome. Frowning slightly, Han Shua thought for a moment and said, 3,500 gold coins isn't a problem, but as for the black gold, or could it be that your merchant guild can't get it? Black gold ore is the same as black iron ore, and is the best material for forging weapons. The price of this ore is beyond your imagination. A piece of black gold, or the size of a fingernail, can be sold for 5,000 gold coins on the black market. Under normal circumstances, black gold ore and black iron ore are both priceless. I have a piece of black gold or the size of a thumb in my hand, but this piece of black gold ore was obtained with great difficulty. I plan on gathering enough materials to forge the best sword for my master, so I've kept it. Although this piece of black gold ore meets your requirements, I won't sell it to you no matter how high a price you offer. Phoebe's face was solemn as she spoke firmly to Han Shua. Phoebe was already a swordmaster, and Han Shua didn't even need to think with his toes to imagine what level her master was at. The sword used by this kind of person would naturally be the sharpest and most extraordinary. Phoebe had reached the level of a swordmaster at such a young age, so she definitely wasn't someone that an ordinary academy of magic and force could teach. It looked like this Phoebe was quite mysterious indeed. However, Han Shua really needed the black gold ore. He wanted to make the Demon's Lair edge the best it could be and naturally needed the rarest and most complete materials. If he was missing such a precious piece of black gold ore, then the quality of the Demon's Lair edge would be greatly reduced. This was something that Han Shua didn't want to see. His brow furrowed deeply. Han Shua thought hard for a while and finally asked Phoebe, "Apart from you, who else has this kind of black gold ore?" "Don't even think about it. I think that even if someone has it, they'll treasure it like a treasure and won't sell it to you." Phoebe looked at Han Shua's anxious expression with interest, and a faint smile appeared at the corners of her mouth as she spoke with a bit of pride. Han Shua couldn't help but feel a wave of dejection when he heard these words. As he shook his head and sighed, he suddenly noticed the unintentional smile on Phoebe's lips. His thoughts spun rapidly, and Han Shua thought silently for a while. Finally, he stared fixedly at Phoebe and asked lowly, "Miss Phoebe, as long as you're willing to give me the black gold ore in your possession, you can raise any conditions." Phoebe started and looked at Han Shua with surprise. She then furrowed her brow and pretended to think for a moment. Finally, she said a bit reluctantly, "Since you helped us last time, I can bear the pain and part with what I love, but you must help me with something else." "What is it?" Han Shua thought to himself that Phoebe had indeed planned this beforehand. He was angry in his heart, but didn't show it on his face as he responded with a darkened face. "Act with me and help me kill Grover's two most loyal dogs, Darnell and Una. These two bitches who should be hacked into 1,000 pieces." Phoebe's face was frosty as she spoke through gritted teeth. "What are their strengths?" Han Shua asked with a calm face. "Darnell is a senior swordsman and has the possibility of breaking through to the level of a swordmaster. Una is a fire adept mage, and her strength is equally frightening. These two are a shameless and licentious couple and won't be apart for long periods of time. They're currently living in the Buzzed Merchant Guild. As long as you're willing to help me, I have a 60% chance of silently assassinating them." Phoebe's body suddenly straightened, the twin peaks in front of her chest appearing exceedingly high as she spoke with a bit of excitement. "I agree." Han Shua didn't hesitate and said lowly. However, she had a favor to ask, so she only snorted coldly and didn't say anything. After Han Shuo had applied poison powder to the crossbow bolts and dagger, Han Shuo thought for a moment and pulled out a few sharp steel needles from his thigh. He was very patient, applying poison powder to these needles as well. Phoebe snorted lightly again when she saw this, seeming to despise Han Shuo's actions greatly. When everything was done, Han Shuo put away all his weapons and finally looked at Phoebe, saying, "Oh right, why didn't you directly make a move against Grover, and instead went to kill 2 lackeys who wouldn't be of much use?" Grover holds some key items of the guild in his hands. He's placed these items in the hands of one of his trusted mistresses. If Grover dies, his mistress will certainly publicize these items. This will be a devastating blow to our guild, so before I kill Grover, I must first find his mistress and grasp these items in my hands. Phoebe flicked a glance at Han Shuo and explained a bit unwillingly. The larger the guild, the more shady transactions there were. For example, when Han Shuo had plundered the Orc Wolf Rider's resources last time, those items should have originally belonged to the shops in the town of Droll. The Empire had long since made it clear that citizens had to hand over these resources if they obtained them. Fabian and Han Shuo's transactions were already considered a violation of the Empire's laws. If the Empire knew of the Buzzed Merchant Guild's actions, the guild would be hard-pressed to escape punishment. For a guild like the Buzzed Merchant Guild, there were certainly many more similar illegal transactions. It looked like these important items were in Grover's hands. No wonder Phoebe didn't dare make a move against Grover lightly. The two of them discussed some details in low voices when the carriage suddenly came to a stop. The coachman said softly from the front, "Miss, we've arrived at the back door of the guild. Let's go." Phoebe looked at Han Shuo and dismounted first. Han Shuo stuck his head out and looked left and right before dismounting as well. "Miss, come in quickly and be careful. Grover has just left the Buzzed Merchant Guild with a few experts. We don't know where they've gone, but they'll usually return at night." An old man from the Buzzed Merchant Guild was waiting at the back door. When he saw Phoebe and Han Shuo appear, he hurriedly moved aside to let the two in. "Thank you for your hard work," Phoebe said to the old man and glanced at Han Shuo, walking quickly into the Buzzed Merchant Guild. Han Shuo followed closely behind Phoebe, also moving quickly. "Most of the people in the guild are Grover's people. I can only mobilize a few old men, and this is all because Grover doesn't know of my relationship with them. There are many guards inside, so we must be careful. Otherwise, if we're discovered, not only will the assassination fail, but it may even be difficult for us to leave alive." Phoebe was extremely familiar with the Buzzed Merchant Guild. When she brought Han Shuo along quickly, they avoided quite a few guards and didn't forget to remind Han Shuo repeatedly. The sky was now completely dark. There was no moon tonight, and the thick black clouds in the sky blocked out all light. Some of the lights in the corridors of the Buzzed Merchant Guild couldn't shine too far. Phoebe lived up to her strength as a swordmaster all right. Her nimble body surprised Han Shuo greatly. Her body was silent as she darted about, and her speed was very fast. After Han Shuo had calmed down, his extraordinary facial features surprised Han Shuo. The dark of the night couldn't obstruct Han Shuo's vision at all. Even without the illumination of the lights, Han Shuo could clearly see the fish swimming in the pond under the fake mountain in the distance. The footsteps coming from far away and the low murmurs in some rooms were all clearly audible to Han Shuo. Han Shuo's calmed movements were also incomparably nimble, like a cheetah searching for prey. He didn't make a single sound as he silently followed behind Phoebe. Suddenly, Han Shuo quickly closed in and grabbed Phoebe. He brought Phoebe's body and suddenly squeezed into a crack in a nearby fake mountain. The crack in the fake mountain was very narrow, and when the two squeezed in, their chests pressed tightly against each other. Han Shuo could feel the ample bosom of Phoebe. Phoebe's pretty face was enraged as she glared fiercely at Han Shuo, her eyes looking like they were about to spit fire. "Shuo." Han Shuo raised his index finger and made a shushing gesture. His eyes darted around, indicating that something was wrong with Phoebe. The anger on Phoebe's face hadn't disappeared even after Han Shuo's actions. A trace of bashful red spread across Phoebe's slender, fair neck. Now that the two's thighs were pressed against each other and their chests were pressed against each other, they could even feel each other's heartbeat. An ambiguous atmosphere instantly spread and rippled. As if she didn't dare look at Han Shuo again, Phoebe pressed her cheek against Han Shuo's ear and said in an extremely low voice, "If there's nothing wrong, I'll kill you." Han Shuo's face turned bitter, but he calmed himself and didn't say anything. When he felt extremely light footsteps approaching, he couldn't help but slow his breathing. He even shook his head slightly, wanting to warn Phoebe, who knew that because Phoebe's jade lips were moving closer to Han Shuo's shake of his head actually caused Phoebe's fragrant lips to directly press against Han Shuo's cheek. Just as Phoebe's breathing was unsteady and she was a bit angry from embarrassment, Han Shuo had already turned his head with difficulty and used a resolute gaze to signal Phoebe to be careful. Phoebe had the cultivation of a swordmaster after all, and her mental fortitude wasn't weak. At this critical moment, she only took a deep breath and her rapid heartbeat immediately calmed down. However, because she took a deep breath, her ample breasts involuntarily puffed up, causing Han Shuo to almost moan uncontrollably. My wind barrier clearly sensed movement, and I rushed here as fast as I could. Why didn't I discover anything? Is it because I've been too careful lately? A man's voice muttered to himself in a low voice not far from the two of them. After this voice appeared, extremely light footsteps slowly rang out in the surroundings. If it wasn't for the fact that Phoebe's attention was at its highest and that this person was extremely close to them, it would have been very difficult for her to hear these footsteps. Since he was a wind mage, if he used wind magic, he could indeed greatly reduce the weight of his body. His walking speed would be faster than that of an ordinary mage or warrior, and his footsteps would be lighter and more silent. It was no wonder that even with Phoebe's strength as a swordmaster, she could only detect movement when he got close. As Han Shuo and Phoebe were on tenterhooks, this person patrolled the surroundings once before quietly leaving. However, this time, Phoebe didn't dare to act rashly. She was afraid that her judgment would be wrong. She glared fiercely at Han Shuo, as if trying to find clues from Han Shuo's face. After a while, Han Shuo exhaled lightly and said in a low voice, "He's gone." Phoebe used both her hands and feet to forcefully squeeze out from the cracks in the fake mountain after he'd spoken. She lowered her head and said softly, "I'll let it go this time. Next time something like this happens, find me a wider place, or I won't let you go." Phoebe circled around the area after she'd spoken and hurried in another direction. When she saw that Han Shuo wasn't following her with a wry smile, she couldn't help but put her hands on her hips and scolded softly, "You don't want the black gold or any more?" "Coming." Han Shuo responded and followed a bit helplessly, thinking to himself, "Where am I going to find a wide hiding place for you at a critical moment?" They didn't run into any more unexpected incidents after that. Phoebe led Han Shuo around a path and avoided a few waves of guards before finally entering Darnell and Yuna's room. "Let's make some preparations and wait for these cheese to return," Phoebe immediately said through gritted teeth as soon as they entered the room, as if she wanted to vent all of her anger from just now on Darnell and Yuna. And so, Han Shuo and Phoebe began to get busy, preparing to assassinate Grover's two loyal lackeys who were about to return. Chapter 72. The door creaked open, and the two slowly walked in, slowly making their way to the edge of the bed where Han Shuo was hiding. At this moment, a setup that had been set up beforehand had produced a miraculous effect. Han Shuo had already tampered with a few of the legs of the round table that had been placed in front of the door. Because the two were incredibly anxious, they didn't make a detour around the round table, but rather flew towards it, planning on using it as a foothold to quickly leave the room. It was at this moment that light footsteps gradually approached from an extremely far distance. Han Shuo's brow furrowed as he carefully discerned and said to Phoebe, "They should be back. I can hear them." When Han Shuo raised the crossbow in his hand and aimed it at Darnell, he discovered that both of them were completely naked. Yuna's snow-white left thigh already had a crossbow bolt stuck in it. She grit her teeth in pain as she walked, and her body wasn't nimble enough. Darnell was even more wretched. His lower body was a bloody mess of flesh and blood, and he had an expression of inconsolable grief on his face as he howled in agony like a wolf. A shrill cry that was 10 times more painful than Yuna's suddenly emitted from Darnell's mouth like a pig being slaughtered. The two's minds that had just reached the peak of pleasure completely cleared up, and they suddenly dashed out of the room from the bed as they yelled, the agonized cries from their mouths never stopping. At this moment, Han Shua's ears had already heard light footsteps in the distance. He rushed towards the two again after a moment of panic. Phoebe had already destroyed the water dragon at the same time, and was also chasing after the two with a speed that wasn't inferior to Han Shua's. The two had just steadied themselves when they saw that they were completely enveloped by Phoebe's sword. Darnell suddenly pulled Yuna and pushed her into Phoebe's sword under Yuna's horrified gaze. He himself didn't even turn his head to look at Yuna as he recklessly dashed out of the room. "Oh, it looks like your master must be a very powerful assassin," Han Shua said lightly. Han Shua didn't respond and followed Phoebe's previous instructions. He crouched down and rolled to the side, landing under the bed. Seeing that Han Shua was ready, Phoebe's beautiful eyes scanned the surroundings and suddenly leapt up, using the chandelier to hide in the shadows of the roof. After a while, just as Han Shua could clearly feel Phoebe's breathing increase and was afraid that she wouldn't be able to hide her tracks, the actions of the adulterous couple above grew more and more violent. The loud panting and moans grew louder and louder, and the movements of the bed continued to increase. It was obvious that they had reached a critical moment. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. The two of them landed on the round table, and with a creaking sound, a few of the table's legs suddenly broke. "Let's go," Yuna yelled loudly at this moment. If it was according to Han Shua's original personality, he naturally wouldn't have been so cautious and steady when dealing with a matter. However, because of his training in magical yuan, Han Shua had basically been constantly enduring inhuman pain. This had unknowingly formed Han Shua's tenacious and indomitable personality. "No. Do you think I'm you? From the moment I entered the guild until now, I've always been working under your command. I think you wouldn't have been able to grasp these methods without some special experience. It looks like you've been an assassin before, otherwise how could you be so skilled?" Han Shua lifted his head to sweep a glance at Phoebe after he'd finally cleaned off the wooden splinters on the bed. A series of rustling sounds of clothes being taken off, mixed with Darnell's lewd laughter and Yuna's light panting, gradually filled the room. An exceedingly light panting fell into Han Shua's ears. Han Shua suddenly started, and then immediately sensed that the panting should have come from Phoebe on the roof. He didn't know if she was angry or also affected. Han Shua, who was under the bed, heard the sounds above him and felt the sway of the bed. He didn't need to think to know that the adulterous couple had already begun fighting. The hot-blooded Han Shua couldn't help but start imagining the scene above in his mind. He desperately wanted to climb out to take a clear look, and his body had long since become uncontrollably aroused with strong masculine characteristics. The sounds of kissing followed, as Darnell's lewd laughter and Yuna's panting grew louder and louder. The wooden bed above Han Shua's head turned from calm to a small boat amidst giant waves, rocking and rocking continuously. A moan that sounded like a sob suddenly traveled out from Yuna's mouth, followed by a series of banging sounds and panting moans, mixed with Yuna's uncontrollable moans. A crossbow bolt flew out like lightning, shooting straight for Darnell's back. Darnell, who was howling in pain and shock, was actually still able to sense the danger behind him at this moment. The long sword he'd long since drawn flared with a deep green light as he suddenly turned around and swung, shattering the crossbow bolt that Han Shua had shot at him. The dagger in Han Shua's hand had locked onto a small hole in the wooden bed that he'd long since pierced through before Yuna had even finished saying, "Stab?" He stabbed viciously upwards. However, the timely appearance of the water barrier bought the two a few seconds of time. The two screamed as they ran out of the room. However, the chandelier hanging from the ceiling suddenly came crashing down halfway through the room, forcing Darnell to stop again and raise his long sword to sweep the chandelier to the side. Han Shua fired another bolt from the crossbow in his hand, and then carelessly tossed it to the side. Han Shua's dagger was already upon him when Darnell had shattered the crossbow bolt. Due to the pain of losing his manhood, Darnell's face had turned to madness amidst his grief. His fighting aura was raised to the maximum as he swung his sword to meet Han Shua's dagger. Han Shua and Phoebe understood that if they didn't kill the two of them now, they wouldn't have another chance once they left the room. Therefore, they used all their strength to keep the two of them in the room. Darnell glared viciously at Han Shua, but didn't give chase. He covered his lower body with his left hand and continued to rush out of the room. Heh, her skin is as smooth as silk, and her face looks like it's been painstakingly drawn by an artist. It's said that she hasn't even tried a man yet. It would be a pity for such a beauty to not enjoy my strength before she dies, Darnell said with a lewd smile. However, the poison powder that Han Shua had smeared on his dagger finally took effect at this moment. Darnell's footsteps suddenly became as heavy as 1,000 pounds after he'd taken 2 steps forward. Han Shua quickly closed in before he could react and swung his dagger again, taking Darnell's life. A water dragon had appeared out of nowhere and was attacking fiercely around Phoebe. However, a section of the water dragon's body was cut off with each stab of Phoebe's sword, turning into mist before it even landed on the ground. Arg! Yuna cried out in pain and suddenly called out loudly, "Assassin!" Han Shua had already rolled out from under the bed after the stab. Lifting his head, he discovered that Phoebe's body was shrouded in black night clothes. A large ball of milky white fighting aura blossomed from the long sword in her hand. The ball of fighting aura was dazzling in the dimly lit room, so blinding that one's eyes couldn't be opened. It was already enveloping Darnell and Yuna, who were trying to escape. Who would have thought that this stab of the dagger would strike Darnell's manhood? No wonder his screams are even more tragic than Yuna's. Han Shua thought with a wicked glee. Phoebe also listened attentively when these words were spoken. It was only a few breaths after Han Shua's voice had sounded that Phoebe finally heard the approaching footsteps. She couldn't help but look at Han Shua in shock and say in a low voice, "No matter how strong or weak you are, your extraordinary senses of foresight are already quite frightening." After experiencing the trials of the dark forest and Claude's death, Han Shua's cautiousness and steadiness had also been silently trained to the point of no return. Add to that Han Shua's astounding senses. This indeed made Han Shua fit the characteristics of a competent assassin. No wonder Phoebe would ask such a question. At this moment, even ordinary people could hear the clatter of footsteps. A man and a woman's teasing laughter sounded from far outside the room, accompanied by the sounds of kissing. Darnell wanted to madly chase after Han Shua when he saw Han Shua immediately stumble backwards, but he suddenly discovered that the long sword in his hand was boiling red. The skin of his right hand that held the sword was burning with unbearable pain, and he immediately threw the long sword away in shock. At this moment, Phoebe, who had just descended from the roof, and Han Shua, who had fired an arrow, rushed towards the two at the same time like cheetahs. Phoebe had been planning on dealing with Darnell, but a trace of panic and disgust appeared on her face when she saw Darnell's naked body. She raised her sword and stabbed at Yuna in the blink of an eye. "How did you so miraculously discover the traces of the wind mage Ellis when he came over?" Phoebe frowned in confusion as she looked at Han Shua while inspecting the interior of the room. Snorting lightly, Phoebe shut her mouth. She couldn't help but exclaim softly after a short, while as she noticed Han Shua's movements. "Have you been an assassin before? Why are you so calm and cautious, and have such extraordinary senses? Damned pervert, you'll die under a woman's crotch sooner or later." At this moment, Han Shua and Phoebe had arrived at the same time. Phoebe stabbed out with her sword, her target already enveloping the two of them. After killing Darnell, Han Shua abruptly set his eyes on the space ring on Darnell's finger. He reached out to remove it, but felt that it was a bit strenuous. At this moment, a faint sound of something piercing through the air suddenly sounded. Han Shua's entire body tensed as he immediately knew that Phoebe had made her move. He focused all of his attention. "Sweetheart, are you in the mood today? Being so wanton at a banquet, who have you taken a fancy to this time?" Darnell laughed lightly and teased Yuna. Spitting out a mouthful of fresh blood, Han Shua was unable to completely defend against Darnell's fierce fighting aura rushing into his body. Although he was restrained by the magical yuan, he immediately stumbled back a few steps. Heh, I'll let you die under my crotch first. What does that have to do with you? You're just a wild beast who only knows how to think with the lower half of your body. All you're thinking about right now is that little bitch Phoebe. If it wasn't for you making a move against Phoebe last time, we would have completed Grover's mission long ago and killed that little bitch Phoebe. Because of your mistake, her guards arrived in time and we almost didn't make it out. Yuna complained to Darnell as she sat down on the edge of the bed. Let's go. Han Shuo called out softly and immediately rushed towards Phoebe's side. A faint fragrance suddenly spread from Phoebe's direction. Han Shuo took a whiff and didn't pay much attention to it. When he saw that Phoebe's eyes were a bit odd, he hurried the dazed Phoebe. A barrier of water suddenly appeared amidst the rapid chanting of an incantation. The azure barrier of water covered the two's heads, and suddenly transformed into a sky full of rainwater amidst Phoebe's milky white fighting aura, pouring down on the two's bodies. Han Shuo could only hear the sounds from underneath the bed, but Phoebe on the roof had likely already seen all of their movements because she had to pay attention to the two at all times. Because the slightest bit of distraction was not allowed during an assassination, Phoebe couldn't tear her gaze away from the two. According to Darnell's words, Phoebe was still a virgin, and this sort of stimulation was probably even more intense for her than for Han Shuo, who couldn't see what was happening below. Han Shuo was crouching on the ground at this moment, carefully collecting the powder of the splintered wood on the ground into his space ring. He didn't lift his head and directly responded, "This is my business, it has nothing to do with you." "Shut up, you're not allowed to slander my master. My master is a true swordsman. He wouldn't do such a thing." Phoebe's face grew even colder as she glared fiercely at Han Shuo. He used the same method to cut off the ring finger of Yuna's left hand, collecting her space ring as well. He casually picked up the crossbow that had been tossed aside earlier and pulled Phoebe with him as he leapt up. Using a hole in the roof that had been opened long ago, the two of them quickly fled along the roof. The two of them had used all their strength to begin with, intending to use the force of their stomps to fly out. However, the collapse of the round table had caused their bodies to lose balance, and they suddenly lost their footing. Their bodies swayed as they fell with the table. "You're the one who's been an assassin." Phoebe rolled her eyes coldly at Han Shuo and continued, "However, my master has taught me knowledge in this area, and the details of assassinating are also part of my homework." Time was of the essence, and Han Shuo couldn't help but slash down with his dagger, chopping off the middle finger of Yuna's left hand and putting away the finger with the space ring. Han Shuo had already seen a bloody hole in Yuna's chest when he turned his head. It looked like she'd been killed by Phoebe as well. Han Shuo's attention was at its highest at this moment. Darnell and Yuna couldn't sense Phoebe's concealment, but Han Shuo could already hear Phoebe's heartbeat and breathing quicken. It looked like she was in a state of extreme rage. Inwardly startled, Han Shuo couldn't help but conceal himself even more carefully, planning to cooperate with Phoebe at any moment to make a move first. Holding his breath and concentrating, Han Shuo's breathing and heartbeat became slower and slower, until it was almost deathly still in the end. His entire mind was a sheet of clarity as Han Shuo went through the layout of the various items in the room once again in his mind. Only then did he focus all of his attention on the newcomers. Han Shuo and Phoebe had already set up everything in the room after a while. Pfft. Chapter 73. Grover led a group of buzzed merchant guild guards and barged into the room as soon as Han Shuo had left. "Who did it? Who did it? I've spent so much gold coins on you guys for nothing, and yet not a single one of you discovered the assassin's arrival. If the assassin's target was me, I'm afraid that the ones lying on the ground wouldn't be the two of them." Grover immediately flew into a rage as soon as he entered and saw the scene before him. He roared loudly at the people behind him. "Mr. Grover, the assassin this time was quite brilliant. He was able to avoid my wind barrier and assassinate both Darnell and Yuna in such a short amount of time. This proves that the assassin's strength is absolutely beyond our imagination." A long-haired man with a slightly dark face spoke to Grover after observing for a while. Breathing out lightly, Grover looked at the long-haired man and said a bit apologetically, "I'm sorry, Ellis. I lost my composure a bit. Wind Mage Ellis was still expressionless as he looked at Darnell's dead left hand with some astonishment. He made a light sound and walked closer to Darnell's body. Glancing at Darnell's left hand that had lost a finger, Ellis couldn't help but say suspiciously, "The middle finger of Darnell's left hand, where the space ring was worn, has been chopped off. What's going on? Not only Darnell, but even Una is the same. Could it be that this assassin killed for the sake of wealth?" Grover was also a bit suspicious when he heard Ellis' words and opened his mouth to speak. "Impossible." Ellis resolutely denied and then surveyed the surroundings before explaining. If the assassin wanted to kill for wealth, he wouldn't have targeted the two of them because their combined strength is the most difficult to deal with. Not to mention that there are many valuable items in the guild. If he only wanted wealth, he wouldn't have needed to make a move against the two of them. With the strength that the assassin has displayed, he could have easily and soundlessly obtained even more benefits from the Buzzed Merchant Guild. Grover thought for a moment after he'd said this and nodded. He said with a dark face, "If it wasn't murder for money, then it must be my good niece Phoebe's doing. Who would have thought that she'd endured until now and finally couldn't hold it in any longer?" "That's right. It must be Phoebe's doing." Darnell and Una had personally tried to assassinate Phoebe last time. Although the two of them failed and retreated, I believe that Phoebe definitely knew that they were the ones who did it. After all, Darnell's gaze towards Phoebe was far too obscene and unique. Even I, an outsider, could discern it, and Phoebe, the person involved, should be even more aware. None of us were harmed, and only the two of them died. That was enough to explain the problem. However, it looks like the assassin is a bit greedy. Otherwise, he wouldn't have forgotten to take the space ring even in such a dangerous situation. When did Phoebe have someone like that by her side? Ellis frowned, speaking slowly as he thought. Grover started and mused for a moment. His face suddenly darkened and he said coldly, "I know who it is. It must be that Brian who helped Phoebe kill the 3 shadow ghost experts a while back. I heard from the guards that this person came to Fabian to do business and should be in need of money. Since his strength was enough to kill the 3 senior swordsmen sent by Shadow Ghost, he does indeed have the strength to kill Darnell and Una. Damn it, how did Phoebe buy this kid? I don't know where Phoebe hid him. He hasn't appeared by Phoebe's side since he left the guild last time. I've sent people to keep an eye on him for a long time and still haven't found any traces of him. This is going to be a bit difficult." Ellis nodded and came to a conclusion. "It seems like it is indeed him. I think we should throw caution to the wind and get rid of this person first. Otherwise, we can be assassinated by him at any time." "All right, pass down the orders. Don't assassinate Phoebe for now. Use all your strength to find the person by Phoebe's side. He's ruined my plans twice. I'm going to make his life a living hell." Grover's face was sinister as he spoke coldly. At this moment, Han Shuo, whom Grover hated to the extreme, had already taken Phoebe far away from the Buzzed Merchant Guild and were hurrying towards her residence in the northern part of the city. Phoebe didn't know what was going on, but her mind was a bit absent-minded and her body was boiling hot. She was practically hurrying along with Han Shuo's constant dragging. The two of them were dressed in night clothes and didn't attract much attention as they darted through small alleys in the middle of the night. However, as they got closer and closer to the northern part of the city guards appeared more and more frequently on the road, forcing Han Shuo to continuously avoid them. At this moment, Phoebe, who had originally known to hurry along under Han Shuo's dragging, gradually lost the ability to even move her feet as her body heated up. Out of helplessness, Han Shuo didn't care if Phoebe agreed or not and directly carried Phoebe on his back. In order to avoid the attention of the city guards, Han Shuo temporarily gave up on immediately sending Phoebe back to her residence and instead brought Phoebe all the way to the cemetery behind the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. That place was the quietest, and there wouldn't be anyone patrolling at all. Add to that the fact that Han Shuo was the most familiar with that area. That was the first place he thought of in times of danger. Han Shuo carried Phoebe on his back and circled around the northern part of the city, passing through a few winding paths and entering a forest. As soon as they arrived, Han Shuo carried Phoebe and directly walked into the stream. At this time, it was almost winter, and the weather was already very cold. In the middle of the night, the river was naturally even colder. When Han Shuo pressed Phoebe into the river and splashed a few waves of water on Phoebe's head, Phoebe suddenly sneezed a few times. Han Shuo also dived into the water. Once the ice-cold river flowed over his head, Han Shuo's rush suddenly cooled down, and his body completely calmed down. Bah! Bah! After Phoebe sneezed a few times, her body was affected by the ice-cold river, and her consciousness gradually recovered. After spitting out the cold water in her mouth, the red glow on Phoebe's face gradually disappeared, and her pair of blurred eyes slowly became clear. Where is this? Why am I here? Achoo! Phoebe looked around blankly, and suddenly sneezed again. As she sneezed and lowered her head, Phoebe suddenly saw that her high and soft breasts were actually exposed to the air. The snow-white skin and the bright red on the peak caused a strong stimulation to Phoebe in an instant. Pa! Han Shuo's face had been slapped. Phoebe's face was almost crazy with anger, and she screamed at Han Shuo, "Beast, what did you do to me?" At this time, Han Shuo really did feel a bit guilty. Looking at Phoebe, who was about to go crazy, he stammered and spoke incoherently. When Phoebe saw Han Shuo like this, she suddenly burst into tears. In an instant, she lost her usual cold arrogance and solemnity, and started punching and kicking Han Shuo without a care for anything else. Water suddenly splashed in the small river, and waves of water flew towards Han Shuo. However, it was because of Phoebe that she received a strong stimulation at this time. It caused her to seem to suddenly forget that she was a powerful swordmaster, and instead, she was like a shrew, punching and kicking Han Shuo without any fighting energy or technique. If Phoebe had used fighting energy and attacked with her strength as a swordmaster, even with Han Shuo's initial success in magic, it was likely that Han Shuo would be seriously injured if not dead after this series of punches and kicks. But now, this kind of attack landed on Han Shuo's strong body, and it was like scratching an itch, without any pain at all. Han Shuo endured Phoebe's series of venting with a grimace. It wasn't until Phoebe was tired and her little fists became weaker and weaker that Han Shuo finally said with a wry smile, "We've all been drugged, but your body is still clean." When Han Shuo said these words, Phoebe became a bit more clear-headed. She stopped what she was doing and stood 2 fists away from Han Shuo. She stood in front of Han Shuo and sized up Han Shuo with a pair of slightly red and swollen eyes. She was a bit afraid of being hit and said with a trembling voice, "Really? You really didn't do that to me?" "When you calm down, I'll find you for the black gold ore. Goodbye." Han Shuo knew that it was useless to talk to Phoebe at this time. A woman who had lost her rationality was the scariest magical beast in the world, especially when this woman was a swordswoman. To Han Shuo, the danger she posed was comparable to that of a dragon-like super magical beast. Sighing at his bad luck, Han Shuo didn't dare to stop. He quickly rushed out, heading in the direction of the tomb. He gradually left Phoebe behind, who was unfamiliar with the terrain. Chapter 74. By the time he'd arrived at the Cemetery of Death through the transportation matrix, the sky had already begun to brighten. It had been exactly 1 day and 1 night since he'd left and returned. Han Shuo finally breathed a sigh of relief when he hurried to the original demon cave to inject fresh blood and magical yuan. The original demon cave couldn't be stopped for a single day. If he didn't inject fresh blood and magical yuan every day, then all of his efforts over the past 20 days would have been for naught. Sitting down on the ground, Han Shuo's fighting aura finally began to run amok in his body due to Darnell's injection of fighting aura. A sudden impact caused Han Shuo to taste sweetness in his throat, and he almost spat out another mouthful of fresh blood. He was overjoyed instead of shocked. Standing up abruptly, Han Shuo laughed heartily and quickly walked out of the Cemetery of Death, heading towards the waterfall where he trained his magical yuan. When he arrived at the waterfall, Han Shuo braved the torrential river and sat down in his usual spot. After his body swayed a bit in the beginning, Han Shuo once again sank into training his magical yuan. For 7 days in a row, apart from injecting fresh blood and magical yuan into the original demon cave at regular intervals, Han Shuo stayed under the waterfall to train his magical yuan. Han Shuo's strength rapidly improved amidst his hard training. Borrowing the fighting aura that Darnell had left in his body and the ferocious impact of the waterfall, the meridians and bones in Han Shuo's chest, waist, and abdomen were reforged anew. When Han Shuo felt that Darnell's fighting aura no longer existed, he could clearly feel that his body had become unprecedentedly better. In the next few days, Han Shuo temporarily stopped training his magical yuan and studied the beginner magics of necromancy, while taking care of the original demon cave. He was so familiar with the book that he could almost recite it from memory. Han Shuo had already marked down some of the knowledge that he didn't understand. As he continued to meditate with the round green ball, Han Shuo's mental strength also grew stronger by the day. As Han Shuo continued to experiment, he finally managed to release the spell Agony of the Soul one day. At this time, Han Shuo was wild with joy. He understood that after a few months of accumulation and the substantial increase in his mental strength, he had finally advanced from a magic apprentice to a novice mage. A novice mage could grasp the 3 spells of Agony of the Soul, summoning zombies, and bone spears. It was just that after trying for a long time, Han Shuo had only managed to grasp the spell Agony of the Soul by chance. As for the other basic zombies and bone spears, Han Shuo couldn't release them no matter how hard he tried. Connecting this to the many areas that he didn't understand when he studied beginner magics of necromancy, Han Shuo understood that blindly reading wasn't a good way to quickly increase his strength. It looked like he needed to find Fanny and ask Fanny about some of the magical knowledge that he didn't understand, as well as retrieve the weapon forging materials and black gold or that Phoebe had promised him. But before he decided to return, Han Shuo still planned on refining the original demon first. The original demon cave had been in operation for a full 34 days and would be completed in 2 days. Han Shuo wasn't in a hurry to leave, so he first went to the dwarves' village and contacted them. He returned to the mine again and excavated for a day, obtaining a small piece of black iron ore, as well as several dozen pieces of iron and copper ore. Han Shuo understood from Phoebe that black iron ore was an extremely rare and valuable ore. Han Shuo would often only be able to excavate a very small piece after excavating for a day. Therefore, Han Shuo immediately stored the black iron ore into his space ring, and the iron and copper ore were directly thrown into an empty storage room in the Great Hall of the Cemetery of Death when Han Shuo returned to the Cemetery of Death. On the eve that the original demon cave was about to be completed, Han Shuo stayed in the Great Hall of the Cemetery of Death. He thought for a moment and took out Darnell and Yuna's space rings. Their severed fingers had naturally been removed by Han Shuo a long time ago. The 2 space rings were one black and one green. The black one belonged to Darnell, and the jade green was Yuna's. If the owner didn't die, then the mental imprint of the owner of the space ring would never disappear. Even if the owner entered someone else's space ring, they wouldn't be able to take away the items within. Except, now that Darnell and Yuna were both dead, the mental imprint of the owner of the space ring had naturally disappeared. First, Han Shuo held Darnell's black space ring in his hand and immediately rushed into it after concentrating his mental strength. The space inside was the same as the one Han Shuo had. Apart from a few longswords, bows, and spears, there was also a set of sparkling silver armor, a book on training fighting aura, a few changes of clothes, some aphrodisiacs, a crystal card to store gold coins, and 100 or so scattered gold coins. He took out the clothes and threw them away, and threw the weapons he didn't need into the storage room where the iron and copper ores were stored. The remaining armor, fighting aura book, some aphrodisiacs, and 100 or so gold coins were all placed into his space ring. The crystal card that might have held a large amount of gold coins was basically useless since Darnell was already dead and couldn't be verified. It was also casually thrown into the storage room by Han Shuo. Streaks of red light that resembled lightning constantly appeared and suddenly disappeared from within. After an indeterminate amount of time, a crisp crack suddenly sounded from within the original demon cave. Like glass shattering, the various bizarre scenes that enveloped the original demon cave suddenly disappeared without a trace under a gust of chilly wind. 3 dark red illusory figures, dragging a strange long tail behind them, danced merrily around Han Shua's body, as if rejoicing in the joy of being reborn. An inexplicable feeling spread from the three original demons to Han Shua's heart. Following Han Shua's thoughts, the three original demons obediently flew into the sky, their bodies turning from solid to incorporeal, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was as if three pairs of eyes had suddenly appeared. The three original demons hid their tracks according to Han Shua's instructions, and were distributed in three directions of the cemetery of death. With the help of the three original demons, Han Shua could see the entire cemetery of death in all directions. Not a single place could escape Han Shua's observation. With a thought, the three original demons whistled and arrived in front of Han Shua. Following Han Shua's thoughts, they suddenly burrowed into Han Shua's body, becoming as small as ants, and entrenched themselves on a piece of bone on the back of Han Shua's neck. Haha, this is indeed very interesting. With these 3-inch original demons, I have 3 more pairs of eyes. As long as I release them, I won't have to worry about being followed and ambushed. If I use the 3-inch original demons to assassinate others, it'll be the enemy's nightmare. Han Shua laughed heartily as he continuously released the original demons with his thoughts and absorbed them into his body, practicing tirelessly. It was at this moment that Little Skull, who had been lying in the original demon cave, suddenly stood up and slowly crawled out. The 7 bone spurs on his back actually began to flap rapidly, and his body abruptly shot up into the sky with the strength of his 2 legs. There were 7 bone spurs on his back. 6 of them were arranged in 2 rows, like the wings of an insect. The remaining one went straight to his buttocks, like a tail. As he shot into the sky, he swayed and danced with joy. The 2 rows of bone spurs on his back flapped fiercely, and the tail-like bone spurs swayed continuously. It was like the head of a bicycle, and seemed to be able to help him move agilely in the air. The last tail-like bone spur swayed to the left, and the little body of the Little Skull fell to the left. When the bone spur swayed to the right, the falling body of the Little Skull would fall to the right. It was quite a miraculous sight. Han Shua was dumbfounded as he watched the Little Skull swaying and falling from the air with a face full of shock. His brain couldn't react for a moment. After a while, the Little Skull fell from the air with a plop, and the bones all over his body made a series of swaying sounds. The Little Skull was also dizzy from the fall. After he stood up with the little bone knife, he actually walked around in circles as if he was drunk. Stinking brat, you've only been walking for a few days, and you already want to fly. Han Shua looked at the Little Skull's appearance and felt extremely distressed. He quickly rushed in front of the Little Skull and knocked on the Little Skull's smooth forehead. It was very miraculous. When Han Shua knocked with his finger, the Little Skull immediately stopped his drunken swaying and sat down on his butt like a child. He even stretched out his hand and scratched his head, as if he didn't understand what he had done wrong. This Little Skull had been carefully cared for by Han Shua since the first time he was summoned by Han Shua. Under the continuous cultivation of demonic arts, he actually gradually began to move like a human. Han Shua's feelings for this Little Skull were deeper than anyone else's in this world. Seeing it fall from the sky, he was really worried to death. When Han Shua saw that the Little Skull's skeleton did not fall apart, and other than the bones swaying a little from the fall, there was nothing else. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. After taking a closer look, he suddenly realized that the originally black bones of the Little Skull actually carried a faint hint of dark red. It was no longer a pure black color. If he didn't look closely, he might not have noticed it. That's strange. The original demon cave was originally used to refine little demons, but he insisted on going in and even had a look of satisfaction on his face. Now that he's out, his body has changed, and he's even learning from the little demon original demon, whose body is in between reality and illusion to fly. It looks like this stinking brat has changed again. I don't know if this change is good or bad. Even I don't know what this guy looks like now. Han Shua stared at the Little Skull and observed it carefully, muttering to himself. After a period of contemplation, when Han Shua discovered that he was unable to understand the changes in the Little Skull, he couldn't help but shake his head and stop thinking about it. looking at the original demon cave that no longer had any abnormalities due to the appearance of the little demon, original demon. Han Shuo chanted a magical incantation and sent the little skull back to the other dimension. Now that his injuries had recovered, the 3 original demons had been refined, and even the little skull had regained its mobility. Thinking of some unsolved magical knowledge and the piece of black gold or that Phoebe owed him, Han Shuo organized a bit and returned to the Empire's Asen City through the transportation matrix. Chapter 75. Asen City, Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. Han Shuo ate breakfast and bought a new set of clothes before arriving at the academy in the morning. Han Shuo first went to the library and surreptitiously put the 2 books he'd entrusted Jack to steal, Foundations of Necromancy and Magical Dictionary, back where they'd been, and then made his way directly to the lab where Fanny was. The door to the lab wasn't closed. Fanny was wearing a black magic robe with gold trimmings and a pair of black-rimmed glasses. She held a magic staff in her left hand and a pin in her right. She was currently drawing magical patterns on a round table in the middle of the room, explaining something incessantly. Fitch, who was beside her, put on an attentive appearance, but his eyes often lingered on Fanny's face. Fanny, wearing glasses, was less charming and bright, and had more of a serious and intellectual beauty. This didn't diminish her beauty in the slightest in Han Shuo's eyes, and he also looked deeply at Fanny with a bit of intoxication. Fanny lifted her head to look at the dumbfounded Fitch after a round of explanations and asked with a frown, "Fitch, do you understand?" Fitch was instantly roused from his reverie and nodded, smiling faintly. "Master Fanny, you've explained very clearly. I understand now." When Fanny lifted her head to look at Fitch, she saw Han Shuo standing in front of the door. Han Shuo was now a bit taller than Fitch, and his body appeared quite valiant due to his constant training in battles. He stood there with a straight back, like a javelin, and didn't have the slightest trace of a mage's frail appearance. Fanny was stunned at first, seeming to be a bit surprised by Han Shuo's unwitting changes. But when Fanny saw Han Shuo looking at her with an intoxicated expression, she couldn't help but panic and blush. She tightened her grip on the pin in her right hand and almost snapped it in half. "What's wrong with me?" Fanny exclaimed inwardly and involuntarily took a deep breath. She glared at Han Shuo with a bit of resentment, then raised her head and snorted, "Brian, long time no see. You disappeared for a month after the last trial. Where have you been fooling around? Why have you come back to the academy now?" Han Shuo's expression immediately returned to normal when he heard Fanny speak. He laughed lightly and walked rudely into the room without waiting for Fanny's greeting. He responded, "The last trial in the dark forest made me understand of my shortcomings, so I borrowed a magic book and crammed some foundational knowledge of magic. I've come to consult Master Fanny because I've run into many problems. I come. Who'd believe you? You're always so secretive." Fanny rolled her eyes at Han Shuo, obviously not believing Han Shuo's words. She turned her head to look at Fitch and felt that Fitch's presence was a bit of an eyesore. This kind of thing can't be explained with common sense. If you use that method to invade my brain and turn me into an idiot, then my life will be over. Fanny furrowed her brow slightly in thought when she heard Han Shuo's words. She thought for a bit and sighed involuntarily. She then said with a smile, "Forget it then. I'm willing to lose a test subject, but I can't lose a talented student." Han Shuo also breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that Fanny had let him off the hook so easily. He thanked Fanny from the bottom of his heart and took out the Beginner Magics of Necromancy book, asking Fanny about some of the areas he didn't understand. Fanny looked at Han Shuo with surprise when she saw that Han Shuo had taken out the Beginner Magics of Necromancy book from his space ring and saw that many of the areas had been annotated by Han Shuo. She exclaimed softly, "You're already reading this book? Have you already grasped all the spells that a magic apprentice should know? Oh, you've even added a lot of annotations. It looks like you really haven't been slacking off during this time. I've misunderstood you." Of course I've already grasped all the spells that a magic apprentice should know," Han Shuo said with a smile. He thought for a moment and released the agony of the soul spell in front of Fanny, causing Fanny to cry out again in shock. "Oh my gosh, Brian, you're really too incredible. You actually have enough mental strength to release the agony of the soul spell. This means that your mental strength has indeed reached the level of a novice mage. You're a genius, a true genius." Han Shuo wasn't sure if he was a genius, but Han Shuo knew that the reason why his mental strength could increase so quickly was because of that strange green ball. Even now, Han Shuo still didn't know what this green ball was, but he was sure that it had something to do with the cemetery of death. After Fanny's series of exclamations, Han Shuo began to seriously ask Fanny about the magic knowledge that he didn't understand. As an adept mage, Fanny had always been doing her homework on how to teach her students about magic. She was very familiar with the basics and patiently explained each and every difficult problem to Han Shuo. The two of them were very close during this process, and Han Shuo could smell the delicate fragrance on Fanny's body. The two of them looked at each other during the explanation. Because of some common understandings, there was a tacit feeling of mutual admiration. Fanny didn't seem to dislike Han Shuo's closeness. Every time Han Shuo clearly understood what she was saying, she'd slap Han Shuo's shoulder in praise. Unknowingly, the two of them had talked for a few hours in Fanny's lab. Fanny didn't show the slightest bit of impatience, but rather seemed to enjoy meeting a good student. It wasn't until a bell rang that Fanny was startled back to her senses. "Apologies, the miss has left and isn't home for the time being. However, I think she'll be back soon. If you're not in a hurry, you can wait here for a while." "All right then, I'll wait for her for a while." Indeed, not long after, Han Shuo's ears could already hear the sound of someone knocking on the door from afar. He couldn't help but feel nervous as he thought about how he should speak to Phoebe when he saw her later. Just as Han Shuo's brow was furrowed in deep thought, a man's soft exclamation sounded. "Eh? You're Brian, right? What are you doing here?" Han Shuo started and immediately raised his head to look. He discovered that Lawrence, who'd spent 5 gold coins to hire him as a human target, was actually standing in front of the door with Phoebe. "Senior brother Lawrence, you know him?" Outside the door, Phoebe looked at Lawrence in surprise and spoke with a bit of surprise. "Of course, he's Brian, an errand boy of our Babylon Academy of Magic and Force." Lawrence responded matter-of-factly. "Errand boy?" Phoebe and Fabian exclaimed at the same time. Phoebe sized up Han Shuo with a strange expression, but said to Lawrence, "Senior brother, your Babylon Academy of Magic and Force is the most renowned school in the Empire. How can there be such a despicable, shameless, and lowly person?" Lawrence started when these words were spoken and shrugged at Han Shuo, smiling at Phoebe, "Junior sister, how has Brian offended you? I rather admire Brian's persevering and indomitable character." Han Shuo's face was wry as he sat there and didn't respond. He lowered his head and drank his tea, cursing inwardly. He hadn't thought that this Lawrence would be Phoebe's senior brother. Now that his identity had been exposed, if Phoebe insisted on pursuing what had happened back then, it would be a bit troublesome even if he wanted to hide. Chapter 76. Senior brother Lawrence, come with me. I'll give you what you need. Phoebe couldn't help but speak to Lawrence when she saw that Han Shuo didn't say anything, only drinking mouthful after mouthful of water with a wry expression on his face. She seemed to find it boring as well and couldn't help but speak to Lawrence. Before leaving, Phoebe glared hatefully at Han Shuo with her bright eyes. She paused and said, "If you're not in a hurry, wait for me for a while." Han Shuo lifted his head to look at Phoebe and clearly felt Phoebe's suppressed anger. He remembered that he still needed to rely on her for the Demon's Lair edge and immediately nodded helplessly. Phoebe led Lawrence to the side. Fabian looked at Han Shuo with an extremely odd expression when he saw them leave. He asked in astonishment, "Brian, you're only an errand boy at the academy? My goodness, but you have such high strength. What's going on?" "Nothing's going on. Oh right, this Lawrence is an ordinary journeyman knight at our academy, but Miss Phoebe has the strength of a swordmaster. How come the two of them have the same master?" Han Shuo was quite puzzled and asked Fabian. Although knights and swordsmen could practice the same fighting aura, they both had the same master. Lawrence was only a journeyman knight, but Phoebe had the strength of a swordmaster. The difference between the two was too great. Han Shuo had heard from the two that Lawrence was the senior brother and Phoebe the junior sister. This made Han Shuo feel even more puzzled. I'm not very clear about the Miss situation either. I was only an insignificant character in the Buzzed Merchant Guild before. I've only heard that before the chairman died, the Miss was studying outside and only came back once or twice a year. If it wasn't for the chairman's sudden death, Miss Phoebe likely wouldn't have suddenly stayed behind. Lawrence also only appeared in my sights recently. They seem to have a good relationship, but I have no way to answer your questions. Fabian looked apologetically at Han Shuo and opened his mouth to explain. Han Shuo didn't ask any more questions after hearing his words. He nodded and frowned in thought. After a while, Phoebe and Lawrence once again stood in front of the door. Phoebe looked at Fabian and instructed, "Fabian, help me see senior brother Lawrence out. I have some things to discuss with Mr. Bryan in private." "Yes, miss." Fabian sensibly stood up and walked towards the door. "Bryan, I'm very happy to see you here. If you still want to earn a few more gold coins, you can come find me at any time. However, I don't think you need it anymore." "All right, goodbye, Bryan. I think we'll have a chance to meet again in the future." Lawrence looked meaningfully at Han Shuo and smiled lightly as he walked outside with Fabian. Phoebe walked in with a cold face as soon as the two left. She flicked a glance at Han Shuo after sitting down and snorted lightly, "You still dare to see me?" "Why wouldn't I dare?" Han Shuo's eyebrows rose, and he stared at Phoebe without backing down. "I haven't done anything wrong, not to mention you still owe me something. As long as you give me the materials and black gold or you promised, I'll leave immediately and won't do business with you in the future." Slap. Phoebe slammed the table and glared at Han Shuo angrily. You still have the face to ask for things from me? Damn it, you violated me. I'm already being polite by not killing you." "Nonsense. You and I were both under the influence of aphrodisiac back then. I was the one who pulled you away from the Buzzed Merchant Guild. Otherwise, you'd already be done for. Not to mention, I didn't really do anything to you. Otherwise, I wouldn't have carried you into the river." Han Shuo was truly angry now. He thought to himself that he'd worked so hard for an entire night, and not only had he not gotten a single thing, he'd even been beaten up by her. There was no need to mention how much he'd treated Phoebe at that time. Yet this Phoebe was still harping on this matter. Could it be that she really wanted to renege on her debt? Clang. Phoebe unsheathed her long sword and glared angrily at Han Shuo. Han Shuo also slammed the table and immediately stood up. He glared fiercely at Phoebe, as if he was going to fight to the death with a single word of disagreement. The two stared at each other and maintained this posture for nearly a minute. Phoebe pouted and put her long sword back into its scabbard with a clang. She turned her head away from Han Shuo and said coldly, "What exactly do you want?" "Very simple. I'll buy the other materials at the price you gave me and return the black gold, or you owe me. Our debt will be written off. We won't have anything to do with each other in the future, and I won't continue to do any bullshit business with you." Han Shuo sat down with a gloomy face and drank the water in front of him in one gulp, speaking crisply, "You despicable snob, here you go. All of it is yours. Now get out." Phoebe flared up with anger for no reason when she heard Han Shuo's words. Her expression was one of uncontrollable fury as she took out a large bag of items from her space ring in a somewhat irritable manner. She put it down with a clang and pushed it in front of Han Shuo, glaring fiercely at Han Shuo as she spoke. You've already prepared everything? Why didn't you say so earlier? You've hurt our friendship for nothing." Han Shuo was planning to take the items and leave when he saw that the bag of items had been placed in an orderly manner. There was a strange piece of metal in the middle, and it was contained in a small transparent bottle. The two words, "black gold," were written on the bottle. It looked like Phoebe had already prepared everything and had no intention of going back on her word. However, what puzzled Han Shuo was that since Phoebe clearly had no intention of going back on her word, why was she so hostile as soon as she walked in? She even said that she didn't plan on giving him anything. This was quite baffling to Han Shuo. "Give me your crystal card and I'll transfer the gold that should be given to you into your crystal card." "Heh, I actually don't have any other intentions. I just want to take back what belongs to me. Han Shuo smiled a bit awkwardly, but still put the bag of items into his space ring first. He then smiled sheepishly at Phoebe. Still not looking straight at Han Shuo, Phoebe's face was cold and haughty as she said in a distant tone, "No need. I'm not as stingy as you. It's only 3,500 gold. Just take it as a gift from me. Don't let me see you in the future, Scram." Han Shua's face stiffened when he saw that she was still mocking him. He nodded and put down a piece of black iron, or that he had mined the day before with a bang. He said in the same cold voice, "I don't like to owe favors to strangers. This piece of black iron, or will be my compensation for purchasing your other ores. Goodbye, Miss Phoebe. I won't do business with you in the future." Just as Han Shuo was about to leave the room with a resolute expression, Phoebe suddenly stood up and looked at Han Shuo with a face full of confusion. Her wise eyes were full of weakness and fatigue as she said to Han Shuo in distress, "Stranger, you treat me as a stranger?" Shrugging his shoulders, Han Shuo said suavely, "Since you don't treat me as a friend, of course I won't shamelessly stick to you." After saying this, Han Shuo smiled freely and walked out of the room. But before Han Shuo could walk out the door, Phoebe suddenly called out softly, "Wait." Looking back at Phoebe, Han Shuo asked calmly, "Miss Phoebe, is there anything else?" Phoebe's expression was a bit odd as she lowered her head in silence. When she lifted her head, most of the weakness and fatigue on her face had disappeared. Her gaze that looked straight at Han Shuo made Han Shuo feel very odd. In the end, Phoebe even curled the corners of her mouth and revealed a faint smile, saying, "Brian, you're saying that you already treat me as a friend?" Astonished, Han Shuo nodded and replied matter-of-factly, "Of course, we've gone through 2 life and death situations together at the Buzzed Merchant Guild. Not to mention that you've helped me out a bit. I already treat you as a friend. It's just that you don't want to." "Who says I don't want to? Humph, apart from monetary transactions, are you so heartless to all your friends?" At this time, Phoebe's expression had actually returned to normal again. She had a bit more humanity than usual and spoke to Han Shuo with the same attitude she had spoken to Lawrence earlier. "Of course not." Han Shuo responded, "Very good. Since we're friends, I have some things to tell you." Phoebe's expression was sincere as she thought for a bit and stared at Han Shuo. "Brian, after we assassinated Darnell and Yuna last time, Grover thought that you were the culprit. He teamed up with Shadow Ghost to fully investigate your origins. You told him that you were Brian at that time, so I think that it won't be long before he finds out that you're at the Academy. Unless you leave the Academy and abandon the name Brian and live with a different identity, you'll have an endless amount of trouble." Phoebe's words were filled with sincere concern. Han Shuo could clearly feel it and felt a bit of warmth in his heart. His expression also softened a bit. After thinking carefully, Han Shuo felt that Phoebe's words shouldn't be a problem. He frowned and said to Phoebe, "Then, what do you think I should do? Come with me and get rid of Grover. Otherwise, we'll never have a day of peace." Phoebe's charming face was frosty as she spoke word by word. After musing for a bit, Han Shuo suddenly felt that a life surrounded by danger seemed to be more suitable for him to break through his limits. His life before had been too monotonous. Perhaps a bit of excitement would be more interesting. Add to that what Phoebe had said. If he didn't get rid of Grover's threat, he would likely have endless troubles. After musing for a bit, Han Shuo said resolutely, "All right, I promise you. Then, accompany me to the Buzzed Merchant Guild's private banquet tonight. Some of the guild's founding elders will also be present at the banquet." Phoebe's charming face lit up with joy when she saw that Han Shuo had agreed and immediately said, "What am I going to do at the banquet your Buzzed Merchant Guild is holding?" Han Shuo started and asked, "Win the goodwill of the other founding elders and be on guard against the old thing's schemes. Brian, I need your help. You just said that we're friends, right?" Phoebe stared fixedly at Han Shuo and asked. Han Shuo suddenly felt like he'd boarded a pirate ship. He felt a bit strange, but he had indeed gone along with Phoebe's intentions earlier and admitted that the two were friends. There was no way to back out now, and Han Shuo could only brace himself and agree. Exclaiming softly, Phoebe said with a smile, "That's great. Wait a moment. I'll have someone make a fitting robe for you." I also need to teach you some basic etiquette for nobles. I've just learned from Lawrence that you're from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. I think you're not very good at these things. Han Shua looked unhappily at Phoebe and said, I was an errand boy, but that's all in the past. There's no one I can't meet or speak of. My apologies, Brian. I didn't mean anything else, really. Phoebe couldn't help but feel a bit worried when she saw Han Shua like this and hastily apologized sincerely. It's all right, tell me. I'll listen seriously. Han Shua waved his hand carelessly, indicating for Phoebe to quickly start. This is black iron ore. As if she just discovered it, Phoebe looked at the black iron ore that Han Shua had placed on the table and looked at Han Shua with a face full of astonishment. She asked, You actually have black iron ore? It looks like you're planning on forging the best weapon. Of course. Han Shua responded affirmatively. After that, Phoebe explained the simple etiquette of nobles to Han Shua. Han Shua understood that if he wanted to climb to a higher level in this world, these necessary etiquettes did indeed need to be mastered. Therefore, he listened earnestly to Phoebe's explanation and even tried to perform some basic etiquette actions according to Phoebe's requests. When night fell, Han Shua changed into the formal attire that Phoebe had specially prepared for him and looked quite decent. He followed behind Phoebe and rode the carriage to the Buzzed Merchant Guild for the third time. Many luxurious carriages were parked in front of the door. The guards had been changed again, and they were two unfamiliar faces to Han Shua. When Phoebe and Han Shua alighted from the carriage together, they didn't need the guards to greet them and walked in with familiar ease. Phoebe led the way through two corridors and appeared at the entrance to the banquet. Niece Phoebe, this is our guild's private banquet. It doesn't seem very appropriate for you to bring him in, does it? In front of the banquet, Grover held a goblet full of fine wine and was chatting cheerfully with a few obviously wealthy guild elders. When he saw Phoebe and Han Shua walk in, he first glared venomously at Han Shua before speaking to Phoebe. Uncle Grover, this Mr. Brian isn't an outsider. Phoebe pursed her lips and laughed lightly. She looked a bit bashfully at Han Shua and explained. Oh, then good niece, can you tell me why he's not an outsider? Grover narrowed his eyes and sized up Phoebe like a venomous snake, speaking in an enigmatic tone. He's my boyfriend. Phoebe raised her head and looked Grover in the eye without fear, saying proudly, Chapter 77. Boyfriend? Grover was startled and looked Phoebe up and down with an extremely odd gaze. He then looked at Han Shua with an even more odd gaze, as if he couldn't believe it, and confirmed once more, Is he really your boyfriend? Of course. Phoebe nodded affirmatively and reached out with a blushing arm to hold Han Shua's left hand, as if to prove their relationship. As if an egg had been shoved into his mouth, Han Shua's mouth gaped wide open with a dazed look on his face. He only reacted when he felt Phoebe's small hand secretly tighten around his arm. He laughed dryly and nodded, but didn't open his mouth to explain anything. An elder of the trading firm who was chatting cheerfully with Grover couldn't help but ask Grover in a low voice, What's the background of this kid? Grover didn't say much and only shot a look at the person, then moved aside a bit and said with a smile, Since he's Phoebe's boyfriend, then there's no problem. Hurry up and come in. Forcefully pulling Han Shua along, Phoebe's expression was as usual as she walked into the great hall. She smiled at a few of the elders along the way, and then pulled Han Shua towards a place with fewer people. Inside the great hall, waiters were carrying platters of fruit and fine wine, placing them on a wide square table in the center. An enormous chandelier hung overhead, emitting bright light. The entire great hall was decorated magnificently, surprising a country bumpkin like Han Shua quite a bit. However, what surprised Han Shua the most was Phoebe's words just now. When he saw that there was no one around, Han Shua immediately smiled wryly at Phoebe. I say, Miss Phoebe, what do you mean by this? Casually picking up a goblet, Phoebe poured herself a cup of rosy fine wine and gracefully took a sip. She then said, Don't think too much. I'm just finding a cover for your identity. There's no other meaning. If I didn't say this, I'm afraid you wouldn't have been able to come in at all. Nodding, Han Shua sighed helplessly and said, I knew that nothing good would come out of coming with you. You have to act a bit more naturally. I'll help you deal with it. This is our guild's annual gathering, and all the elders will be here. As bold as Grover is, he wouldn't dare make a move at this time, so we don't have to worry. Phoebe spoke softly to Han Shuo, but her eyes continuously scanned the surroundings. Similarly, picking up a goblet and pouring half a cup of wine, Han Shuo took a sip and felt that it was quite sweet and sour. After a moment of careful observation, Han Shuo discovered that many of these buzzed merchant guild members had brought their families as well. There were 20 to 30 people in the Great Hall, and among them were old elders, handsome youths, as well as a few attractive women and dignified young ladies. Without exception, all of these people were richly dressed and their actions were refined and courteous. It looked like this was the style of the so-called upper class. Grover held a goblet in one hand as he shuttled back and forth among these people, greeting everyone kindly and appearing to be quite familiar with them. The Buzzed Merchant Guild has always been controlled by our Buzzed family. My father was originally the chairman, but because I've always been traveling, the old thing temporarily took over the position when my father died. However, don't look at how he seems to be on good terms with many of the elders. No one really knows what's going on behind the scenes. Otherwise, it would be useless for me to come back. Phoebe explained to Han Shuo in a low voice as Han Shuo silently observed the surroundings. Han Shuo's thoughts raced when he heard Phoebe's words and he suddenly said, "Your father, how did he suddenly die? Did you not know anything about it beforehand?" A trace of murderous intent flashed through Phoebe's eyes when she heard this question. She then lowered her voice and said with a cold face, "I'm still investigating how my father died and haven't found any evidence yet. Because I've never been in the guild, there are many things I'm not clear on. The elders likely don't believe me and their attitudes are all uncertain. What I need to do now is win the support of these elders. Otherwise, I won't be able to shake the old thing's position in the guild with my own strength alone." Han Shuo understood from Phoebe's words that she was also suspicious of his father's death. He didn't say anything else and held his goblet as he observed the people in the hall, silently weighing his options. After a while, a few more people arrived in succession. Finally, an old man with grizzled sideburns walked into the great hall with the help of a steward. Many people in the hall came over to greet this person when he appeared. When Phoebe saw this, she immediately pulled Han Shuo along and hurried over. She quickly explained in a low voice, "He's Andrew. He founded the Buzzed Merchant Guild with my grandfather. He's one of the most senior members of the guild now, and even Grover doesn't dare be too presumptuous in front of him. If he helps us, we won't be so passive." Phoebe bowed in a reserved manner when she arrived in front of Andrew and said with a joyful smile, "Grandpa Andrew, why have you come as well?" It's our beautiful little Phoebe. Grandpa hasn't seen you in a long time. Heh, you've grown so tall." Andrew's left hand leaned on a cane, and his right hand was supported by a steward as he chuckled merrily at Phoebe. "Good niece, don't just talk and hurry up and let the old man sit in the hall. The old man is getting on in years and must be very tired after riding the carriage all the way here. He can't stand like this anymore." Grover said this to Phoebe when he came over and walked towards Andrew, seeming to want to take Andrew to sit on his side. It's fine. Little Phoebe and I had a great time chatting." Their cooperation could be considered to be tacit. "Uncle Andrew, who do you think is most suitable to be the new chairman?" At this moment, the founding elder with the low, muffled voice looked at Andrew from afar and asked. As he spoke, the gazes of the other senior elders gathered on Andrew. It seemed like they were all waiting for Andrew's response. Andrew looked at Phoebe, who was forcibly putting on a calm expression. He rose slightly and chuckled softly, finally opening his mouth to say, "It's not an old fellow like me, because I don't have many days left to live, heh." Everyone smiled kindly when he said this. Grover also smiled and seemed to heave a sigh of relief, as if he'd been very afraid that Andrew would step forward and fight for the chairman's position with him. However, Andrew swept his gaze across the crowd and continued, "I feel that little Phoebe has already grown up. Since she's the chairman's daughter and a member of the Buzzed family, she should be the most qualified to be the new chairman according to reason. Why hasn't anyone mentioned this? No, absolutely not. Miss Phoebe is still too young and has always been traveling outside. She doesn't know the matters of the guild at all. If she's the chairman, she may drag down our buzzed merchant guild's business. It was still the founding elder who'd always defended Grover who immediately protested fiercely. Kilo, that's hard to say. Although Miss Phoebe is young, I think she understands the big picture and has a sense of propriety in her conduct. Perhaps she can bring the guild to greater development if she's in charge. An elder suddenly opened his mouth to speak. The founding elders who'd been silent all along suddenly echoed when they saw Andrew express his support for Phoebe. There were still 3 or 4 founding elders who didn't say a word, as if expressing their neutrality. How can this be? We can't use the guild's future as a test subject for her abilities. That Kilo, Grover's loyal supporter, immediately spoke up noisily. Why not? If I remember correctly, the old chairman was only 23 years old when he was in charge of the merchant guild. But with the help of Andrew and a few other old gentlemen, the old chairman grew up very quickly and made the buzzed merchant guild flourish with each passing day. I think that Miss Phoebe should be able to do the same. Not to mention that with all of us supporting her, there won't be any big problems. The man continued. Grover's face had darkened since Andrew's words. He finally stood up at this moment and said to Phoebe, "Good niece, this boyfriend of yours was once an errand boy at the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force and had the status of a slave. Don't blame Uncle for being meddlesome, but if others find out that you're with him, it will affect our guild's reputation." When these words left his mouth, some of the elders in the hall immediately focused their attention on Han Shuo. They couldn't disguise their expressions of disdain and disdain. Han Shuo was startled and finally understood that Phoebe's worries weren't without reason. It looked like he'd underestimated the power of Grover and Shadow Ghost. He hadn't thought that they'd be able to discover his origins with just a name. It was a good thing that he'd spent most of his time in the cemetery of death these days. Otherwise, if he'd stayed in the academy, he might have long since been assassinated by experts. "Uncle, what do you mean by this?" Phoebe suddenly stood up at this moment and glared angrily at Grover with a frosty face. She wanted to shed all pretense of cordiality and yell, "Good niece, don't be angry. I just want to tell everyone that your foresight doesn't seem to be very good. In order to be in charge of the buzzed merchant guild, foresight and wisdom are the most important. If you have to choose your future husband from among the slaves, then I think everyone won't be at ease in letting you be the chairman." Grover still wore a peaceful smile on his face, but the words he spoke were quite malicious. A person who would murder his own brother for the sake of profit and continuously send out killers to harm his own niece, I think he's even more unworthy of the chairman's position. Han Shuo also stood up and looked at Grover with a cold, fearless smile, as if he didn't know how deadly his words were. Pausing, Han Shuo spoke again under the astonished gazes of everyone present. "Please remember, I am now a student of the Babylon Academy. I no longer have the status of a slave, and never will in the future." Chapter 78. Shut up, don't make slanderous accusations. Big brother and I have a deep relationship. How could I do such a thing? Good niece, how could you find such a boyfriend who doesn't see the big picture? Uncle truly feels sorry for you. Grover's expression immediately changed as he stood up with a rumble and slammed the table, roaring angrily. His expression as usual, Han Shuo laughed lightly and said with a laugh, "Everyone knows that as the only daughter of the chairman, Phoebe should be the most qualified candidate to succeed the position of chairman. If she were to be assassinated, who would benefit the most? When has it ever been an outsider's turn to speak about the matters of our buzzed merchant guild? Phoebe, you should properly discipline this outsider who doesn't know anything." Grover glared viciously at Han Shuo and then turned his head to speak to Phoebe. Phoebe had already calmed down by this time from her earlier panic. She'd always maintained an amiable facade with Grover, but who would have thought that Han Shuo wouldn't care at all and would be so diametrically opposed from the start, almost immediately shedding all pretense of cordiality with Grover and disrupting all of her steps. She didn't know what to do for a moment. However, when Han Shuo and Grover were refuting each other, Phoebe's thoughts changed, and she felt that Han Shua's actions were rather straightforward. Because of Han Shua's actions, Phoebe's attitude was clearly expressed in front of these elders. This also let them see that she, Phoebe, wasn't a weak person who didn't want to fight for things. Except, now wasn't the time to weigh gains and losses. Since Han Shua had already expressed himself so sharply, Phoebe couldn't do anything even if she wanted to. She immediately said confidently after Grover had finished speaking, "That's right, Uncle Grover. I think I'm qualified to be the chairman of the guild. Although I've been traveling all these years, my father has never given up on teaching me. Moreover, the knowledge I've learned is also related to managing the company. This is all arranged by my father. I hope that Uncle can support me. If there's anything I'm lacking in, Uncle can also teach me. I'm confident that I can manage the company well." "Good niece, your courage is commendable, but this kind of matter is not child's play. A single careless mistake can send the trading company into a situation of eternal damnation. Uncle is cowardly and cannot bear this kind of responsibility." Since they had shed all pretense of cordiality, Grover no longer concealed anything and spoke with a dark expression. It was at this moment that Andrew suddenly stood up shakily with the support of his walking stick. He said, "There's no point in continuing to argue like this. How about this? Why don't we let little Phoebe try first? If the company can develop smoothly in her hands within 3 months, then we'll let Phoebe be the president. Otherwise, it'll be Grover. What does everyone think?" With Andrew's words, apart from the 3 elders who favored Grover, all the other elders expressed their agreement. Andrew waited until everyone had voted before looking at Grover with a smile. He said merrily, "Since the majority has agreed, I think we'll leave it at that for the time being. What do you think?" No matter how unwilling he was in his heart, Grover felt that he couldn't change anything now that the majority of the elders of the company had agreed. In the end, he could only brace himself and say helplessly, "Since that's the case, then we'll do as you wish." Nodding, Andrew smiled. "All right then, I still have some matters to attend to, so I'll be leaving first. Oh, little Phoebe, Grandpa hasn't seen you in a long time. If there's nothing else, why don't you come with me to my house for a chat?" "All right, I was just about to ask Grandpa for some experience in managing the company." Phoebe stood up with a smile and put down her wine cup. She gave Han Shua a look and didn't even look at Grover as she walked out the door. Han Shua put down his wine cup in understanding and flashed a cold smile of disdain at Grover, who was looking at him with a dark expression. He followed behind Phoebe and also walked out of the hall. As soon as they left the company, Phoebe looked around to make sure that no one was around and said softly to Han Shua, "Go back to my residence first. I'll hurry back after chatting with Grandpa Andrew for a bit. We'll talk later." "Heh, little Phoebe, this boyfriend of yours is quite bold. He actually went head-to-head with Grover in the hall. I think you have good taste." Andrew stood beside his carriage and looked at Phoebe and Han Shua with an amiable expression as he spoke with a smile. Blushing slightly, Phoebe looked at Han Shua and said in a low voice, "Be careful on the road." She then walked over to Andrew and said coquettishly, "Of course not. He's so dumb that you don't know how infuriating it is." Han Shua didn't continue to listen to their conversation and didn't ride in the carriage that had come with Phoebe. Instead, he walked towards the north of the city alone. It was already late at night, and there were almost no pedestrians on the road. Han Shua hadn't felt any danger when he'd just left the Buzz Merchant Guild, but when Han Shua had passed through a road and just entered an alley, he suddenly raised his guard. With a thought, 3 original demons were silently released from the back of Han Shua's neck. As soon as the original demons left Han Shua's neck, they immediately transformed into an incorporeal state and concealed themselves in 3 directions without leaving a trace in the darkness. It was as if he'd suddenly gained a few more pairs of eyes. Apart from what was directly in front of him, Han Shua could even clearly see the situation behind and to his left and right. The original demons formed from magical yuan didn't have a trace of fighting aura or magic on their bodies. In their incorporeal state, it was very difficult to detect them with the naked eye. Therefore, the departure and concealment of the original demons didn't alarm anyone at all. Behind Han Shua was the wind adept Mage Ellis that he'd seen last time. His body floated like a wisp of a ghost, silently trailing behind Han Shuo. On the rooftops of the alleys to his left and right, four assassins dressed in black walked silently behind him, slowly closing in on him. Shocked, Han Shuo hadn't thought that Grover would be so daring. He'd made his move right after he'd left the Merchant Guild. It looked like he really did hate Han Shuo to the bone. Han Shuo suddenly calmed down at a time like this that concerned his life and death. There were 5 people in total. Apart from the Wind Adept Mage Ellis, the strength of the other 4 wasn't weak either. According to the observations of the original demons, Han Shuo discovered that the 4 were divided into 2 warriors, 1 mage, and 1 archer. If it wasn't for the fact that the original demons could monitor their movements at all times this time, Han Shuo would have been hard-pressed to escape death. However, now that he had the original demons, although Han Shuo didn't have the slightest advantage in terms of strength, it wasn't like he didn't have any hope of escaping alive. Because on the way here, Han Shuo had already learned from Phoebe's explanation that there was a mansion of Imperial soldiers stationed not too far ahead of the alleyway. The reason why Han Shuo had chosen to walk through this dark alleyway was also because of the mansion in front of him. His mind raced for a moment, and Han Shuo understood that these people could only make their move in this alleyway. Otherwise, once he passed through this alleyway, they wouldn't have a chance. The space ring lit up faintly and Han Shuo grasped the dagger in his right hand. Han Shuo's footsteps were neither fast nor slow as he advanced, paying attention to the movements of his enemies at all times according to the surveillance of the original demons. Finally, when Han Shuo had reached the middle of the alleyway, the 5 assassins, including Ellis, seemed to think that they were in position and suddenly sped up their approach. The faint sound of an arrow breaking through the air suddenly fell into Han Shuo's ears. This arrow was incomparably sharp and shot swiftly and violently towards Han Shuo's back as soon as it appeared. Its momentum was exceedingly fierce. This arrow had come from a professional archer, and the angle was exceedingly tricky and vicious. If it wasn't for Han Shuo observing his movements clearly through the original demons, this arrow alone would likely have killed Han Shuo on the spot. His originally unhurried footsteps suddenly sped up, but he didn't charge forward, instead retreating to the left. With a whoosh, the arrow streaked past the corner of Han Shuo's clothes and suddenly whistled forward. In front of Han Shuo, the arrow suddenly shattered into pieces. Several sharp wind blades had long since been released by Ellis, as if waiting for Han Shuo to subconsciously burrow into them. It was a pity that Han Shuo had detected them one step ahead and forcibly avoided them. At the same time, the top of his head suddenly lit up and a wall of fire abruptly formed, enveloping Han Shuo below. 2 nimble figures instantly lifted long swords and flew down from the roof. Han Shuo could see the light and dark green fighting aura clearly under the illumination of the wall of fire. Suddenly accelerating, Han Shuo's speed soared in a flash, and he suddenly circled around from the left, then avoided the obstruction of Ellis' wind blades and flew towards the exit of the alleyway. Han Shuo had just left his original spot when the wall of fire came crashing down. The place where he'd been standing before was filled with sparks. No matter how they imagined it, they didn't know that Han Shuo had already clearly seen their deliberate concealment through the original demons. They'd originally thought the attack to be absolutely accidental, but Han Shuo had already seen it all. This was why the first wave of attacks from the 5 of them with extraordinary strength had all failed. "We can't let him leave this alleyway alive." Ellis' gentle voice had purposefully become sharp and suddenly rang out at this moment. The archer and the other fire mage stood on the rooftops on both sides of the alleyway. As soon as Ellis' words had landed, they acted at almost the same time. 3 arrows were grabbed by the archer and placed on his longbow. With a whoosh, they shot out swiftly and violently towards Han Shuo's forehead, back, and thighs. Another wall of fire suddenly formed in front of Han Shuo, forcibly blocking off Han Shuo's path and forcing Han Shuo to take a detour. Otherwise, it would be difficult for him to escape the burning of the wall of fire. The 2 swordsmen who just landed took advantage of this moment to quickly approach with their swords raised. They were only 10 meters away from Han Shuo. Ellis' feet didn't touch the ground as he also swiftly rushed over from behind, obviously intending to leave Han Shuo here. His body tilting, Han Shuo changed direction again and circled to the right, intending to go around the wall of fire and rush out of the long street. A few wind blades came whistling over. All of this was within Han Shuo's expectations. The dagger in his hand quickly waved, and 5 wind blades were chopped away by Han Shuo's dagger. However, 3 of the wind blades still slashed past Han Shuo's thigh and arm. Han Shuo had only been hit by 3 wind blades because he'd known beforehand that Ellis had set up wind blades here. Otherwise, if more than 10 wind blades had struck his vitals, he probably wouldn't have been able to take another step forward. Braving the injuries to his thigh and arm, Han Shuo rushed out of the attack of the wind blades and evaded the wall of fire and flying arrows at the same time. He dashed towards the entrance of the alleyway like lightning and had already escaped the second wave of attacks. He was about to rush out of the long street. Right at this moment, a mournful scream suddenly tore through the silent sky. Han Shuo, in the midst of running, suddenly discovered the archer with the aid of the original demons. The longbow in his hand had been broken in 2, and fresh blood was dripping from the corners of his mouth as he fell limply from the roof. Phoebe stood proudly with a long sword in her hand where he'd just been. "Fie, Phoebe, you're actually a sword master." The hooded Ellis had forgotten to change his voice due to his excitement. He used his original voice and exclaimed in surprise. Then, without calling for the others, Ellis' rapidly charging body abruptly stopped. He abruptly turned around and fled at an even faster speed to the back. Phoebe snorted coldly and didn't chase after the fleeing Ellis. After all, if a wind mage ran with all his might, it was indeed very difficult to catch up to him. Waving the long sword in her hand, Phoebe, standing majestically on the roof, landed lightly on the 2 warriors below. It looked like she planned on taking care of the remaining people first. At this moment, Han Shuo had almost made it out of the long alley when he saw Phoebe suddenly appear. He was overjoyed and abruptly turned around, opening his mouth to summon Little Skull and walking quickly towards the 2 warriors. Han Shuo had been running with all his might earlier, so Little Skull hadn't been of much use. Now that a sword master like Phoebe was present, Han Shuo had turned from prey to hunter. It was naturally time for Little Skull to appear and kill the enemy. When Little Skull appeared with the bone dagger in hand, its calf bones started running quickly under Han Shuo's orders. The 7 bone spurs on its back flapped as it rushed towards the roof with a whoosh, attempting to take care of the other fire mage. The fire mage jumped in fright, never having thought that Little Skull would be able to use the momentum to leap onto the roof. In his panic, he immediately chanted an incantation. A wall of blazing flames appeared once again, completely blocking off Little Skull's only path. However, Little Skull didn't care about the obstruction of the wall of flames at all and charged headlong into the wall of flames. When Little Skull walked out of the wall of flames, the fire mage was already in front of him, flabbergasted. It waved the bone dagger in its hand and turned the fire mage into a beehive. Chapter 79. There were only 2 swordsmen left, one senior swordsman and the other journeyman warrior. Just Phoebe alone was enough to make it hard for the 2 of them to escape death. Han Shuo, turning around, only sped up the speed of their deaths. With a flash of his space ring, Han Shuo took out a crossbow and inserted an arrow into it. He was already facing one of the swordsmen. Just as they suddenly retreated and wanted to escape, Han Shuo's crossbow had already been fired, shooting towards the back of the senior warrior's heart. The senior swordsman who had turned around and planned to escape had no choice but to turn around and block the arrow, but by the time he'd shattered the crossbow arrow shot by Han Shuo, Phoebe was already standing in front of him. The Little Skull who'd killed the fire mage held a bag in his left hand and jumped down from the roof with a whoosh. The skeleton shook for a bit and was already standing in front of another journeyman swordsman with his sword. When Han Shuo walked over with a cold smile, the 2 swordsmen suddenly slashed their own necks with the long swords in their hands and fell to the ground. These are the people of Shadow Ghost. If they know that there's no way out, they'll choose to end their own lives. Phoebe shook her head and put the sword in her hand back into her space ring, frowning as she spoke. At this moment, The little skull arrived in front of the two corpses and began to loot their bodies with practiced ease. When he'd hung 2 more bags in his left hand, he picked up the bone knife and walked happily towards Han Shuo, handing a total of 3 bags to Han Shuo, smiling as he touched the little skull's skull. Han Shuo took the 3 bags and cursed out loud after taking a look. Damn it, 3 poor bastards, and only 10 gold coins. Rolling her eyes at Han Shuo, Phoebe didn't examine the corpses and directly said to Han Shuo, I've never seen someone as greedy as you. There's no need to examine the corpses, you won't find anything. The people of Shadow Ghost don't bring anything important when they go out to do things, so just give up, they won't bring you any wealth. Hearing Phoebe say this, Han Shuo cursed again and chanted an incantation to send the little skull away. He then grinned and said softly, Didn't you leave with Andrew? Why are you suddenly back? You're hurt? Phoebe was startled and immediately walked towards Han Shuo. She revealed a worried expression when she saw that Han Shuo's body had been slashed by the wind blades. Her space ring lit up and gauze and medicine appeared in her hands. She no longer held back and said gently, Don't move. It was rare for Han Shuo to see this kind of expression on Phoebe's face, and he was slightly touched. He stood there dumbly without moving and watched as Phoebe carefully applied the medicinal powder on his wounds and bandaged them with gauze. When Phoebe was done, she finally tugged at Han Shuo and exhaled softly, You've picked a good place. There are 2 large mansions around this alley, and the people from both families are gone. No one came out despite the fierce fighting here, so it looks like the houses haven't been sold yet. However, we can't stay here for long. Although the security here isn't very tight, there will still be soldiers patrolling the streets every once in a while. We should leave as soon as possible. Let's go. Han Shuo agreed and left with Phoebe, hurrying towards the northern part of the city. He asked along the way, Right, you still haven't told me why you suddenly came back. Seeing that there was no one around, Phoebe furrowed her brow and said in a low voice, In Grandpa Andrew's carriage, he told me that Grover has been doing business with the barbaric orcs recently. He actually sold the Empire's weapons to the orcs. This matter has too many implications, and the Empire will never let him go once they find out. If I take control of the Merchant Guild, Grover definitely won't be able to conceal this matter. Therefore, he won't wait for me to take control of the Merchant Guild and will certainly kill me before that. Otherwise, once this matter is exposed, Grover will find it difficult to escape the Empire's punishment no matter how strong he is. After I found out about this, I knew that he would definitely kill you first. I was worried about you, so I left Grandpa Andrew midway and came to find you. Nodding, Han Shuo said, So that's how it is. No wonder that Grover wants to kill us so quickly. It looks like as long as you have this bit of evidence, Grover will die without a doubt. That's right. Phoebe smiled coldly and thought for a moment. She sighed and said, However, now that Ellis knows of my strength, I think Grover will definitely think of another way. The next time there's an assassination attempt, I think even I will have a hard time dealing with it. Han Shuo knew that his own strength was limited. If he couldn't even deal with Phoebe, then he likely wouldn't be of much use. The only thing that could help Phoebe was his sensitive senses for assassins. After thinking for a moment, Han Shuo said, I'll leave for a moment and come find you when my injuries have healed. Grover is our common enemy now. I know what to do. All right, but don't return to the academy no matter what. Since Grover knows of your identity, you'll face great danger if you remain in the academy for the next few days. Phoebe mused for a moment and said to Han Shuo, nodding his head to indicate that he understood. Han Shuo told Phoebe to be careful and left by himself. The 3 original demons accompanied him from beginning to end. They didn't discover any other activity until Han Shuo arrived at the cemetery in the mountains behind the academy. After returning to the Cemetery of Death, Han Shuo first practiced a bit of magical yuan. Under the circulation of magical yuan, Han Shuo's wounds had a cool feeling and the pain was greatly reduced. It was already noon the next day after he slept. Now that all the ingredients had been gathered, Han Shuo impatiently left the Cemetery of Death and headed towards the dwarf village. He planned on having the dwarf village chief, Calvin, forge the demon's lair edge for him. The dwarf village was within a small mountain valley, and there were enormous trees covering the front of the village. If it wasn't for the fact that Han Shuo had followed the dwarves here before, he really would have found it difficult to discover where they lived. Now that Han Shuo was familiar with the road, he arrived at the dwarf village in a short while. After passing through the enormous trees, a dwarf standing guard in front of him held a sharp axe in his hand. When he saw Han Shuo, he immediately called out in a friendly voice, "Oh, good friend, you've come again." Following behind the dwarf, Han Shuo passed through a small shrubbery path and finally arrived at the dwarf village. Calvin, Bennett, and the others who had come upon hearing the news all came out to welcome Han Shuo with smiles on their faces. Fine wine was served after a while. The dwarves lived in the small wooden houses they'd built themselves, and some also lived in hollowed-out tree holes. There were only 100 or so dwarves in this village, and women and children made up the majority. Only 60 or so of the able-bodied men could truly fight. After spending time together, Han Shuo had already won the sincere friendship of the dwarves. They were quite generous to Han Shuo, and every time Han Shuo came over, they would welcome him with fine wine and meat, making Han Shuo quite moved. "Han Shuo, how did you find the time to come over this time?" Calvin chuckled as he greeted Han Shuo. Taking out the materials that Phoebe had prepared from his space ring, Han Shuo handed them over to Calvin. "Elder, these are the materials that were prepared according to your requirements. There's enough black iron ore as well. Can you see if you can forge a weapon for me?" Calvin took the materials that Han Shuo had handed over and carefully examined them, saying with pleasant surprise, "Yes, of course I can. It's a happy thing for us to have enough materials to forge a good weapon. Don't worry, Han. We'll start work tomorrow and we'll be able to forge a weapon for you in about a week. You'll be sure to be satisfied." Han Shuo truly breathed a sigh of relief when he heard this guarantee and immediately expressed his sincere gratitude to Calvin. The low complaints of a few dwarven women traveled in from the distance. Han Shuo's ears were quite sharp, and he couldn't help but pay attention to their conversation. "AI, it's almost winter. We won't be able to secure our food in the snow, and the village chief has already taken out his stored rations to entertain the guests. I don't know how we'll get through the winter if this continues." "That's right. A few days ago, I heard that those damned ogres appeared in the vicinity again. It looks like these ogres are going to plunder again in order to get through the winter. If they discover our village, then we'll have to move again. I really don't know when these days will come to an end." Han Shuo heard every word of the dwarven women's conversation. Han Shuo was a bit moved. It looked like the lives of the dwarves weren't as easy as he'd imagined. But even so, they always brought out the best food to entertain Han Shuo whenever he came over. This made Han Shuo feel quite apologetic. After thinking for a moment, Han Shuo sighed lightly and said to Calvin, "Elder, do you not think of me as a friend?" "Han, why would you say that? Could it be that we've done something wrong?" Bennett, who had a good impression of Han Shuo, was the first to exclaim in surprise and look at Han Shuo in confusion before Calvin could open his mouth. Shaking his head, Han Shuo sighed. "Why do you worry about food and the ogres, but not tell me your friend?" "Han, it's because we're good friends that we don't want to trouble you. In addition, because of your help, we've already obtained a lot of ore. We can forge many weapons with these ores. We won't have to be afraid of those ogre villains this year." Calvin sighed in relief when he heard Han Shuo's words and responded with a smile. "No. Since the elder is willing to take out the village's winter rations for me, I have to do something as a friend. Don't worry, elder. I'll head to the human society and help you resolve your winter rations problem. Apart from these, I can help you deliver anything else you need." "How can that be? Although we're friends, we can't trouble you. We also want to purchase these items from the human society, but we'll have to pass through a long stretch of the dark forest to get there. Not only will we be attacked by magical creatures, but we may also run into adventurers with ill intentions. That's why we have to stay here. Han, I know that if you help us purchase these items, it'll cost you a lot of gold coins. We can't trouble you like this. I think if we work a bit harder, we'll be able to make it through this winter," Calvin said. "Then it's decided. I'll help you think of a way to deal with your winter rations and the threat of the ogres. You can continue to focus on forging weapons and leave the rest to me." Han Shuo did some mental calculations. The dwarven village had a population of 100 or so. According to the amount of food stored in the space ring, he'd be able to bring all the food they needed to the cemetery of death after a few teleportations. If he bought it from Phoebe, it probably wouldn't cost much either. Han Shuo was naturally willing to do this for the dwarves. Thank you. I thank you on behalf of my children and the mothers in the village. A dwarf woman suddenly heard Han Shuo's promise when she'd come over to deliver some fruits. She was so moved that she immediately used the dwarven etiquette to express her gratitude to Han Shuo. Hurry up and go down, Calvin admonished, and then said with equal gratitude, Han, we only know how to brew wine and forge weapons. Because we rarely interact with humans, we don't have many gold coins. We're willing to brew wine and forge some weapons for you in exchange. Otherwise, I won't accept your good intentions. Although Han Shuo didn't covet their wine and weapons, he understood the dwarves' stubborn temperament and knew that they wouldn't be willing to accept good intentions for no reason. He finally agreed after thinking for a bit. With Han Shuo's guarantee of winter rations, all the dwarves were seething with excitement. Even Calvin drank to his heart's content with Han Shuo, a rare occasion. One had to say, the wine that the dwarves brewed was indeed quite sweet and fragrant. Even the wine that Han Shuo had drunk in the buzzed merchant guild last night couldn't compare to their brews. Because the demon's lair edge had been secured, Han Shuo was also in a good mood and drank to his heart's content with the dwarves. However, because of his training in magical yuan, Han Shuo had completely awakened as soon as he'd left the dwarven village. He'd vigilantly returned to the cemetery of death. Before continuing to meditate, Han Shuo thought for a bit and decided to once again explore the boundary that was preventing Han Shuo from entering the depths of the cemetery of death. He wanted to see if he could break through the boundary with his current mental strength. After using the round green ball to open up the passageway, Han Shuo focused his mental strength and abruptly burrowed in. His mind was instantly filled with bone-piercing pain, but because he was used to the pain that the round green ball brought him when training, Han Shuo forced himself to endure it. He raised his magical yuan to the maximum and charged straight in. A crisp crack sounded as Han Shuo's body tilted and broke through the invisible boundary, his body falling towards the bottom of the passageway. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.